SCP-1 The Gate Guardian. Chapter 1. The Forbidden Revelation. The wind howled outside Site Alpha, a research facility buried deep beneath the Arctic tundra. Above ground, nothing betrayed its existence except a nondescript metal hatch half buried in snow and frost. Beneath that hatch, hundreds of feet of reinforced steel and concrete housed some of the most dangerous anomalies ever discovered. Here, under layers of secrecy and ice, the SCP Foundation operated in its most shadowed capacity. And Dr. Alina Croft, a Level 4 researcher, had just received an unexpected notification. Her clearance had been upgraded, Level 5. It was unheard of, especially for someone relatively young in the organization. She had barely processed the implications when a voice over the intercom summoned her to the central command room. The sterile corridors of Site Alpha seemed emptier than usual as Alina walked briskly, her lab coat billowing behind her. Something felt off. The usual hum of machinery and distant chatter of colleagues had been replaced by an oppressive silence. Inside the command room, a towering screen displayed the Foundation's insignia. Senior Site Director Hammond stood at the helm, his face lined with age and stress. "You've been granted access to SCP-1, Hammond said without preamble. "Congratulations." Or, "Condolences." Alina's breath caught. SCP-1. The designation whispered in hushed tones among the Foundation's elite. Every researcher had their theories, their speculations, but no one knew for certain what SCP-1 truly was. The files, she'd heard, were fragmented, intentionally, to prevent any single person from uncovering the whole truth. The Gatekeeper unveiled. In a secure terminal, Alina logged in, her trembling fingers hesitating over the keyboard. Her clearance badge confirmed her identity, and the screen before her flickered. What she saw was nothing like she had imagined. A series of encrypted files unraveled, each containing fragments of data, reports, and chilling imagery. At the center of it all was SCP-1, identified as the Gatekeeper. A humanoid figure stood in countless photos and sketches, always depicted in the same place, before a massive, ornate gate carved from a black stone that seemed to shimmer like a starless void. The Gatekeeper was luminous, its form radiating a light so intense it rendered most cameras useless. It bore a sword, a blade of fire, according to the texts that it held aloft, as if guarding the gate from any who dared approach. Utterances varied wildly. Some referred to the entity as angelic, others as apocalyptic. One phrase recurred throughout the reports: "Should the Gatekeeper move, the end begins." Accompanying the files were redacted references to failed experiments. Teams had attempted to study the Gatekeeper and its gate, but every approach ended disastrously. The last experiment, a Black Ops expedition, had been erased from records entirely. Alina leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. Why now? Why was she being shown this? And why did the gate, despite its alien construction, feel hauntingly familiar? A disruption in the void. Her questions were interrupted by an alarm blaring throughout Site Alpha. The lights flickered as the facility's automated systems scrambled to contain the breach. Alina leaped from her chair, adrenaline surging. On a nearby terminal, red warnings flooded the screen. Containment Breach. Multiple anomalies detected. Before anyone could react, the overhead speakers crackled with static. Then a low, distorted voice emerged, cold and metallic. "This is not a test. The Gatekeeper is watching." The transmission repeated, echoing through the corridors as if the words themselves were alive. Alina's heart pounded as she watched the screens shift. Live feeds from the facility showed containment cells breaking open. SCP-173's cell was empty. SCP-96 had disappeared. The revelation. Alina's communicator buzzed. Hammond's voice came through, strained but urgent. "Croft, get to command now. We've got something on SCP-1. She sprinted through the chaos, dodging terrified personnel and containment teams rushing to regain control. In the command room, the giant central monitor now displayed a live feed. The camera view was blurry, overwhelmed by an intense light, but the image was unmistakable. SCP-1, the Gatekeeper, stood motionless before the massive black gate. Its fiery sword flickered with ethereal flames, and its light seemed to pulsate, almost like breathing. The gate loomed behind it, its intricate carvings glinting ominously. "What triggered this?" Alina asked, her voice shaking. "No one knows," Hammond replied. "The broadcast, the breaches, it's all connected to that gate." As she stared at the screen, the image shifted. The Gatekeeper turned its head as if looking directly at the camera. Alina gasped as its eyes, blinding yet strangely sentient, seemed to pierce through the monitor, locking onto her. And then the screen went black. Chapter 2: Containment Breach. The alarms blared louder than ever, their deafening wails merging with the panicked shouts of personnel running in every direction. The staccato of gunfire echoed through the corridors, interspersed with guttural roars and unearthly shrieks. Site Alpha, a facility that prided itself on its unbreachable containment systems, was in complete disarray. Dr. Alina Croft barely had time to process the chaos as she sprinted through the corridors, dodging overturned carts and fleeing researchers. Every screen she passed displayed red warnings. Containment failure. Multiple breaches in progress. Evacuate non-essential personnel. She reached an emergency checkpoint just as a heavily armed Mobile Task Force MTF squad stormed through. Their black tactical gear bore the insignia of Nu 7 Hammer Down, one of the Foundation's elite response teams. At the helm was Captain Dorian Kane, his expression as sharp as the serrated combat knife strapped to his chest. "Dr. Croft," Kane barked, "you're with us. We've got orders to keep you alive." The fight for survival. The team wasted no time moving. Kane led the way with military precision, barking orders to his squad as they navigated the labyrinthine halls. The air was thick with tension, and every shadow seemed to hide a threat. The first encounter came abruptly. A researcher screamed down the hall, his cries silenced in an instant by a sickening crunch. Emerging from the darkness was SCP-173, the sculpture. The unassuming concrete entity stared at them, motionless, until the first MTF operative blinked. It moved in a flash, snapping another operative's neck before the squad could react. Alina froze, the sight of its featureless face locking her in place with terror. "Fine. They don't blink," Kane roared, shoving her behind him. The team coordinated, taking shifts to stare at the anomaly as they maneuvered toward a containment-safe chamber. Sweat dripped down Alina's face as her eyes burned, her vision blurring. They reached the chamber just in time, slamming the reinforced doors shut before SCP-173 could breach. But the respite was short-lived. A guttural, inhuman wail echoed through the facility, sending chills down everyone's spine. 96, Kane muttered grimly. The shy guy's wrath. SCP-916's wails grew louder, reverberating through the walls. The team pushed forward, their movements becoming more frantic as the creature's cries drew closer. The nightmare arrived when an unlucky technician rounded the corner ahead of them, his flashlight illuminating SCP-96's gaunt, pale face. The creature froze for a moment before unleashing an ear-piercing scream. It lunged with terrifying speed, tearing the man apart in seconds. "Don't look at its face," Kane shouted, as the team scrambled for cover. The next few minutes were chaos. Bullets ricocheted off walls as the team tried to redirect SCP-96's attention. Kane tossed a flash grenade, temporarily disorienting the creature and giving the squad just enough time to escape through a maintenance hatch. Alina's heart raced as they crawled through the narrow passage, the distant howls of SCP-96 still echoing behind them. Every step felt like a reprieve stolen from certain death. The Gatekeeper's influence. When they finally emerged into a secure operations hub, the team regrouped. Alina's knees buckled and she slumped against a console, her mind reeling from the carnage. "Why is this happening?" she asked, her voice trembling. "This shouldn't be possible. The systems—" "Forget the systems," Kane interrupted. He gestured to the screens lining the wall. Each one displayed SCP entities in various states of activity. "This isn't random. Something's directing them." Alina squinted at the data scrolling across the monitors. Patterns emerged, anomalies clustering near specific sectors, their actions disturbingly coordinated. Her stomach dropped as she spotted a shared data point in the logs. Anomalous energy. Secrecy 101. Enter friends. Detected. SCP-1 is affecting them, she murmured, piecing it together. It's bending them to its will. Kane frowned. How? And why now? She hesitated. There's an alignment. A global surge in anomalous energy. A data suggests it'll peak in 72 hours. 3 days, Kane said grimly. What happens then? Alina didn't have an answer, but her gut told her it wasn't good. The hidden chamber. As they debated their next move, an alert flashed on a nearby console, displaying an unauthorized access point deep within the facility. The screen showed an area of Site Alpha that wasn't on any official schematics. What the hell is that? Kane asked. A hidden chamber, Alina replied, recognizing the coordinates. She had seen references to it in SCP-1's files, but it had been heavily redacted. Her pulse quickened. We have to go there. Despite the risks, the team agreed. They navigated through abandoned corridors, the sounds of chaos growing fainter the deeper they ventured. The hidden chamber was sealed behind a vault-like door, its surface etched with runes that glowed faintly in the dim light. Alina approached, her hand trembling as she entered a passcode from SCP-1's file. The door groaned and slid open, revealing a room bathed in an otherworldly glow. At the center of the chamber was an ancient artifact, a crystalline structure hovering above a pedestal. Its surface pulsed with light, shifting between hues of gold and crimson. Energy radiated from it, sending ripples through the air. It's a key, Alina whispered, stepping closer. A key to the gate. Kane grabbed her arm. And what happens if someone uses it? Before she could answer, the artifact flared brightly, and a deep, resonant voice echoed through the chamber. The Gatekeeper is watching. The glow intensified, casting long, shifting shadows across the walls as the chapter closed with a haunting sense of foreboding. Chapter 3. The Gatekeepers Prophecy. The air grew colder as Dr. Alina Croft descended into the labyrinth beneath Site Alpha. The spiral staircase leading to the subterranean chamber seemed endless, carved from a stone older than the foundation itself. The dim lighting flickered, casting eerie shadows along the walls, where faint, ancient runes glowed faintly in the dark. Captain Dorian Kane followed closely, his MTF squad flanking him. Their boots clanged against the metal steps, the echo amplified in the silence. This place shouldn't exist, Kane muttered, his voice carrying an edge of unease. How deep does it go? No one knows, Alina replied, clutching a tablet loaded with translations of the artifact's carvings. This is beyond anything we've been briefed on. It predates the Foundation itself. The artifact and the prophecy. The group reached the base of the stairs and entered a cavernous chamber, illuminated by a pulsating golden light. At its center stood the artifact, an obelisk of crystalline material, glowing as if alive. Strange glyphs swirled across its surface, shifting and rearranging themselves as if responding to their presence. Alina approached cautiously. Her tablet beeped as it scanned the glyphs, and the translations began to appear in fragments. The Gatekeeper guards the passage. Beyond the gate lies the unspeakable. To open is to end. The glyphs told of a parallel dimension, a reality infested with eldritch horrors that defied comprehension. The Gatekeeper, SCP-1, stood as a sentinel, preventing these entities from crossing into their world. It's a warning, Alina whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the artifact. If the gate opens, those things will come through. Kane tightened his grip on his weapon. Then we make sure it doesn't. The Traitor's Revelation. Before Alina could continue deciphering, a sudden explosion rocked the chamber. Dust and debris rained down, and the lights flickered violently. Alina stumbled, her eyes darting to the source of the blast. One of Kane's operatives, Agent Holcroft, stood by a shattered control console, a smoking detonator in hand. "Holcroft, what the hell are you doing?" Kane shouted, raising his weapon. Holcroft smirked, his expression cold. "You wouldn't understand. None of you do. The Black Veil sees the truth. That gate isn't a threat, it's an opportunity. Ultimate power, ultimate knowledge. The Foundation has kept it locked away for too long." The room erupted in chaos. Holcroft fired at the squad, hitting 2 operatives before Kane brought him down with a precise shot. The traitor fell, but his sabotage had already done its damage. The main escape route was blocked, the blast sealing off the staircase behind them. "We're trapped," one of the surviving operatives muttered, panic rising in his voice. "No," Kane said firmly. "We find another way out." The vision. As the team regrouped, Alina's attention was drawn back to the artifact. It pulsed more intensely, almost as if reacting to the chaos around it. Against her better judgment, she reached out, her fingertips grazing its surface. A blinding light enveloped her. Suddenly, she wasn't in the cavern anymore. She stood on barren ground under a blood-red sky. The air was thick with ash and the screams of the damned. Monstrous entities, massive, writhing abominations, slithered and stalked across the desolate landscape, devouring everything in their path. At the center of it all stood SCP-1, its fiery sword held aloft. The gate was wide open behind it, a swirling vortex of blackness from which the creatures emerged endlessly. Alina felt the weight of its gaze upon her, its presence overwhelming. "You cannot stop what is coming," a deep, resonant voice echoed in her mind. "The alignment approaches. The gate will open." Alina gasped, the vision breaking as she collapsed to her knees. Kane rushed to her side. "What happened? What did you see?" "They're coming," she managed, her voice trembling. "If we don't stop the gate from opening, it's over." Cliffhanger. The artifact dimmed slightly as if it had exhausted its energy, but its message was clear. Alina looked at the remaining squad members, their faces pale with fear and uncertainty. Above them, distant rumbles hinted at the chaos continuing within Site Alpha. Time was running out. Alina stared at the glowing glyphs, knowing they held more answers, but answers would mean nothing if they couldn't survive. As the team prepared to press deeper into the labyrinth, a low, guttural roar echoed from the shadows ahead. Something had found them. Chapter 4. The Final. The world was unraveling. Dr. Alina Croft sat in a dimly lit command chamber, staring at a live feed of global anomalies flashing across the monitors. Reports poured in from SCP sites worldwide. Containment breaches, unexplained seismic activity, and distortions in reality itself. A pattern emerged in the chaos. All the anomalies were converging, drawn by an invisible force toward a single epicenter. Site. The artifact's exposure had accelerated SCP-1's activation. Every system analysis pointed to a horrifying conclusion. The alignment was just hours away. Alina turned to Captain Dorian Kane and the surviving operatives. "If we don't isolate this artifact and sever its connection to SCP-1, it's over. We move now." Kane nodded, gripping his rifle. "Then we make our stand. Whatever it takes." A desperate journey. The remaining team loaded the artifact into a reinforced transport module designed to shield it from anomalous interference. The plan was to transport it to an isolated containment bunker in Greenland, a location far enough from SCP-1 to disrupt the alignment. But the journey would be perilous. Site Alpha was in shambles, and the Black Veil had already proven their willingness to kill to achieve their goal. As the team navigated through the devastated corridors of Site Alpha, the lights flickered and sparks rained from exposed wires. SCP entities roamed freely, drawn to the artifact's energy. The group narrowly avoided encounters with SCP-106, the Old Man, and SCP-682, the hard-to-destroy reptile, relying on Kane's tactical expertise to stay one step ahead. The Black Veil strikes. The team made it to the surface, where a Foundation transport helicopter waited. The icy wind whipped around them as they boarded, the artifact secured in the cargo hold. Just as the chopper lifted off, an energy blast struck its tail rotor, sending it spinning. Black Veil operatives emerged from the snow, armed with experimental weapons derived from anomalous technology. Their leader, a shadowy figure known only as Cypher, stepped forward. His voice crackled through a loudspeaker. "The gate must open. Hand over the artifact, and we might let some of you live." Kane's response was immediate. "Open fire." The battle was a blur of chaos. Black Veil drones swarmed the helicopter as the team fought to defend the artifact. Cypher deployed a device that destabilized gravity, pulling the team off balance as his operatives moved in. Kane took charge, ordering a retreat while covering the team. He fought with calculated precision, taking down multiple assailants, but their numbers were overwhelming. The artifact destroyed. Cypher's forces reached the artifact. The glowing obelisk pulsed erratically, reacting to the proximity of SCP-1. Alina realized that if it fell into their hands, the gate would open immediately. "We can't let them take it," she shouted to Kane. Kane's expression hardened. He pulled a high-yield explosive from his pack and attached it to the artifact's containment module. "Get to the backup transport," he ordered. "Now!" "Kane, no!" Alina screamed, but it was too late. He activated the timer and charged into the fray, providing the team with a chance to escape. The explosion tore through the battlefield, obliterating the artifact and several Black Veil operatives. Alina and the others barely made it to the secondary transport, as flames and debris consumed the scene. The helicopter soared into the sky, but the devastation below was a grim reminder of what they had lost. The gate opens. Despite the artifact's destruction, the alignment continued. SCP-1's gate began to crack open, its immense doors glowing with an otherworldly light. Waves of creatures spilled forth, grotesque and alien, spreading across the tundra. The Foundation scrambled to contain the breach, deploying countless mobile task forces, but their efforts were futile. Alina stared at the live feed from Site Alpha. The Gatekeeper stood motionless before the gate, its fiery sword glowing brighter than ever. Then, to her horror, it moved. The entity stepped forward, its light enveloping the screen. The gate's energy surged and the creature's advance accelerated. Alina's heart sank as she realized the alignment had only been delayed, not stopped. The Gatekeeper speaks. As the helicopter sped toward Greenland, the cabin was filled with an overwhelming light. Alina turned, shielding her eyes, only to see SCP-1 standing in the cargo hold. Its presence was blinding, yet strangely calming. "Your world is not ready," the Gatekeeper said, its voice resonating in her mind. "But the choice was never yours." Before she could respond, the entity vanished, leaving behind only silence. Alina sat in stunned silence as the helicopter approached its destination. The gate was opening, and the horrors beyond it had begun to spill into their reality. Despite their sacrifices, the alignment was still unfolding. The Foundation's last hope lay in unraveling SCP-1's true purpose before it was too late. Far below, the ground began to quake, and in the distance the gate loomed, a dark promise of the end. Chapter 5. The First Protocol. The ruins of Site Alpha lay in silence, save for the crackling of fires and the distant screams of chaos. The landscape was unrecognizable, an apocalyptic wasteland of shattered steel and smoldering ice. The gate loomed above it all, its massive black doors partially open, spilling a swirling torrent of light and shadow. Creatures from beyond stalked the tundra, their alien forms moving with unnatural grace. Dr. Alina Croft stood at the edge of the devastation, her heart pounding as she gazed at SCP-1, the Gatekeeper. The luminous figure radiated power, its fiery sword held aloft as it stood vigil over the gate. Around her, the last remnants of the mobile task force fought desperately, their weapons barely slowing the monstrous entities pouring through the breach. Alina clutched a secure tablet containing the activation code for the Foundation's most classified contingency plan, the first protocol. It was a failsafe no one ever thought would need to be used, a containment solution designed for SCP-1 itself. "It's the only way," she whispered, her voice trembling. The first protocol required manual activation from the core of Site Alpha, a facility that now lay in ruins. Kane's sacrifice had bought her time, but the clock was running out. Alina sprinted through the debris, her lungs burning as she descended into what remained of the underground control center. Reaching the central terminal, she input her credentials. The screen flickered, prompting her for the final sequence. Her hands shook as she typed the code, her mind racing with doubts. Would this work? Could anything stop SCP-1 in the gate? A confirmation message appeared. First propol engaged. Warning, activation will result in terminal biological sacrifices. Proceed. Alina hesitated, but only for a moment. Proceed, she said aloud, her voice steady now. The room began to tremble as ancient machinery roared to life. A surge of energy radiated outward, creating a massive containment field. The gate's light dimmed slightly, and the creatures froze in place, their movements sluggish as the containment field expanded. As the containment field stabilized, Alina felt a sharp pain in her chest. Her vision blurred, and she collapsed to her knees. The protocol wasn't just a failsafe. It required a human conduit to channel the anomalous energy needed to contain SCP-1. Her consciousness was pulled into the field, and she found herself standing in a void of infinite light. SCP-1 stood before her, its gaze piercing and unyielding. Alina's mind was flooded with visions, countless realities, each shaped by anomalies and catastrophes. She saw the Foundation's true purpose, not just to contain, but to act as a fragile thread holding the multiverse together. "You see now," SCP-1's voice echoed in her mind. The Gatekeeper's fiery sword dimmed, its light merging with Alina's form. She felt a surge of understanding, but also despair. The multiverse was vast, but humanity's place within it was precarious. Final transmission. Back in the ruins of Site Alpha, the containment field began to falter. Alina, barely conscious, used her last moments to transmit critical data to Foundation HQ. Her voice was weak, but determined. "This is Dr. Alina Croft," she said, her words interspersed with labored breaths. "SCP-1 is contained for now. The gate must remain sealed at all costs. There is a way to stop it, but it requires—" Her voice trailed off as the transmission cut out. The containment field collapsed, and the gate's light vanished. SCP-1 was gone, trapped within the field's remnants, along with the creatures it had unleashed. The landscape fell silent once more. The resolution. The Foundation declared an Omega-class threat level. The gate remained closed, but the cost was staggering. Alina's sacrifice was honored, and her research became the cornerstone of a new directive to prevent SCP-1's full activation. Site Alpha was deemed irreparable, its ruins a grim monument to the battle fought there. Post-credits epilogue. In a dark, hidden bunker, members of the Black Veil examined fragments of the destroyed artifact. Cypher, his face obscured by shadow, held a glowing shard in his hand. "This is just the beginning," he said, his voice calm and resolute. "The gate will open, and we will be the ones to control it." The shard pulsed with light, a faint echo of the artifact's former power, as the screen faded to black. The end. For now. SCP-2, The Chapter 1. The Arrival. The desolate mountainside bore the fresh scars of an impact. A massive crater carved into the earth as though struck by a meteor. The air carried the acrid scent of burnt ozone mingling with the metallic tang of disturbed soil. At the center of the crater lay SCP-2, a grotesque fleshy mass that defied explanation. Its surface undulated faintly as if it were alive, pulsating with a rhythm that mirrored a human heartbeat. Dr. Alina Voss stood at the edge of the crater, her dark hair pulled back tightly as she gazed down at the anomaly. Her sharp eyes betrayed no emotion, though her mind churned with both fascination and trepidation. This wasn't her first encounter with the unexplainable, but SCP-2 was unlike anything she had seen before. "This thing doesn't belong here," she muttered to herself, though the statement was as much a reassurance as it was an observation. Agent Malcolm Reed, clad in black tactical gear, descended the slope toward the object. His expression was a mask of calm efficiency, but his body was taut with readiness. Years in the field had taught him to expect the worst when dealing with anomalies like this. "Dr. Voss," he called out, his voice steady. "The perimeter's secure. No civilians, no leaks. We're clear to begin containment." Voss nodded curtly, her attention never wavering from SCP-2. "Good. Let's proceed cautiously. Whatever this is, it's reacting. I don't want any mistakes." A third voice piped up from behind them. "Are you saying it's alive?" Technician Carly Newen, the newest addition to the team, approached with wide eyes, her tablet clutched tightly against her chest. She was eager, almost too eager, her enthusiasm bordering on recklessness. "Alive might not be the right term," Voss replied, her tone clipped. "Anomalous, certainly. The fact that it appears to have structure, a room no less, raises questions we're not ready to answer yet." Carly leaned in slightly to get a better look at the object, her breath catching as she took in the faint outlines of furniture within the fleshy mass. It was surreal. A table, chairs, and even a lamp-like structure, all crafted from sinew, veins, and what appeared to be bone. The longer she stared, the harder it was to look away. Reed noticed her gaze and stepped in front of her. "Don't get too close," he warned. "We don't know what it's capable of." The team set to work erecting a temporary containment unit around SCP-2, floodlights illuminating the bizarre anomaly as they drilled into the ground to secure the structure. Voss directed operations from a distance, her analytical mind cataloging every detail, the subtle shifts in SCP-2's surface, the faint hum emanating from its core, the uneasy feeling that grew stronger the longer she stood near it. Carly, however, couldn't resist getting closer. As she adjusted a sensor near SCP-2's edge, her gloved hand brushed against its surface. The sensation was electric, warm, wet, and disturbingly inviting. She froze, staring in disbelief as the anomaly reacted to her touch. "Dr. Voss, Agent Reed," Carly's voice trembled as she stumbled backward. All eyes turned to SCP-2, where Carly had made contact. A fleshy tendril extended inward, merging with the organic furniture within the room. Before their horrified eyes, a new chair began to take shape, a grotesque amalgamation of muscle, skin, and cartilage. It was eerily human in design, complete with what looked like finger bones embedded in its armrests. Inside, "What the hell just happened?" Reed barked, drawing his sidearm instinctively. Voss's voice was steady, though her face was pale. "It reacted. It used her. It used her touch as a blueprint." The room was silent, save for the faint rhythmic pulse of SCP-2. Carly stared at the chair, her face ashen. "It's alive," she whispered. "It's feeding." Reed's jaw tightened. "We need to lock this thing down now." Voss nodded, her mind racing. SCP-2 was far more dangerous than they had anticipated, and as she stared into its pulsing, fleshy depths, a single thought echoed in her mind. What else would it demand? Chapter 2. The Room's Hunger. The hum began subtly, like the distant vibration of machinery buried deep within the earth. At first, the team dismissed it as a side effect of the containment field being constructed around SCP-2. But as the minutes stretched into hours, the hum grew louder, lower, and more insistent, a sound that seemed to resonate not only in the air, but in their very bones. Agent Malcolm Reed stood near the perimeter, his weapon resting against his chest as he scanned the surrounding area. His instincts, honed from years of field work, were screaming that something wasn't right. Then it started. The compulsion. A technician working near SCP-2 suddenly stopped, his tools clattering to the ground. His body stiffened, and his eyes glazed over as he began walking toward the anomaly, as if drawn by an unseen force. The hum grew louder as he approached. "Hey, stop, stop!" Reed shouted, but the man didn't respond. Without hesitation, Reed rushed forward and grabbed the technician's arm. The man struggled against him, his movements mechanical and uncoordinated, as though he were a marionette being pulled by invisible strings. "Get a grip," Reed barked, shaking him violently. Finally, the technician blinked and gasped, his knees buckling as if released from a trance. "What the hell just happened?" the man stammered, clutching his head. Before Reed could answer, a scream echoed from the other side of the containment field. 2 more personnel were walking toward SCP-2, their faces blank, their steps unsteady. One reached the edge of the anomaly and vanished into its fleshy surface without a sound. The other hesitated for a fraction of a second before following. Reed turned to see Dr. Alina Voss standing frozen, staring at the scene in horrified disbelief. "Voss," he shouted, "what is this thing doing?" She snapped out of her trance, her face pale. "It's compelling them. It's feeding paranoia and distrust." The containment field was completed just as the team's numbers began to dwindle. The remaining personnel clustered in the observation tent, their faces etched with fear and suspicion. The hum was relentless now, vibrating through the ground, worming its way into their minds. "This isn't random," Voss said, pacing the tent. "SCP-2 is exhibiting behavior, intentional behavior. It's expanding its collection by drawing people in." Reed leaned against the table, his jaw tight. "You sound like you're speaking from experience. What aren't you telling us, Voss?" She hesitated, her gaze dropping for a moment before meeting his. "This isn't the first time I've encountered an anomaly with this level of sentience. I've seen things that suggest these objects, these entities, aren't just passive threats. They're aware." Reed narrowed his eyes. "You knew this thing was dangerous and you didn't tell us." "I didn't know it would escalate this quickly," she snapped, frustration coloring her voice. "But now we need to figure out how to stop it before it consumes the entire team." Before either could say more, Carly Nunez entered the tent, her face pale and drawn. "I need to talk to you," she said quietly, her eyes darting toward SCP-2 visible through the tent's translucent walls. "I think it's talking to me." The obsession. Carly's obsession had been growing steadily since her first contact with SCP-2, but now it was undeniable. She spoke in whispers, her words disjointed and eerie. "It's not just a room," she said. "It's something bigger. It's trying to show me something important." "Open." You need to step away from this thing," Reed said firmly. "You're not thinking clearly." But Carly shook her head, her eyes wild. "You don't understand. It doesn't want to hurt us. It wants to include us. It's a part of something much larger than we can comprehend." Voss studied her carefully, then asked, "What has it shown you?" Carly hesitated, then handed over a crumpled piece of paper. "I found this inside. It was in the room, on the table. It's my handwriting, but I didn't write it." Reed and Voss exchanged a look before smoothing out the paper. The writing was unmistakably Carly's, but the contents were chilling. The journal entry detailed events that had not yet occurred, the deaths of several team members, SCP-2's expansion into a vast organic labyrinth, and Carly herself becoming a part of its grotesque collection. Voss read the final line aloud. It's not a room, it's a seed, and it's growing. The realization. The hum deepened, becoming almost deafening, as if SCP-2 was responding to their discovery. Outside the tent, the structure seemed to ripple, its fleshy walls pulsing with life. New tendrils extended outward, inching toward the containment barrier. Reed gripped his weapon, his voice low and tense. We're losing control of this thing. Voss's mind raced, piecing together the clues. It's not just feeding, it's evolving. If we don't find a way to stop it, we'll all become part of its collective. But even as she spoke, she couldn't shake the feeling that SCP-2 was listening, and that it already knew how this story would end. Chapter 3. The Maze of Flesh. The containment field's alarms screamed into the night, their piercing wails swallowed by the throbbing hum of SCP-2. A chill swept through the camp as personnel scrambled to secure the perimeter, but Carly Unwen had already slipped past them, drawn by the siren call of the anomaly. "Nguyen's gone inside," shouted a panicked technician as Reed stormed into the observation tent. "Damn it," he growled, slinging his weapon over his shoulder. "We're going after her." Dr. Elara Voss's face was ashen. "You can't just storm in there, Reed. It's not a room anymore, it's something else entirely." "She's in there alone," he snapped. "We don't have time for your theories." Voss hesitated only for a moment before grabbing her field kit. "Fine, but if we're doing this, we do it smart." The anomaly had grown since the last time they'd seen it. The fleshy mass now loomed like a grotesque, pulsating dome, its surface slick with a sheen of organic fluid. As they stepped through the threshold, the air changed, thick, humid, and alive, with a low, rhythmic vibration that resonated in their chests. The inside of SCP-2 was no longer a single room. It had expanded into an endless labyrinth of organic corridors, each wall lined with grotesque furniture sculpted from human remains. Chairs crafted from spines, tables of fused rib cages, lamps with veins for wiring. It was a nightmarish gallery of SCP-2's creations. Reed scanned the area, his knuckles white around his weapon. "Stay close. This place is a damn death trap." Voss nodded, but her eyes were fixed on the walls. They seemed to shift and breathe, as though SCP-2 were alive. "It's adapting," she murmured. "It's creating space, drawing us deeper." A faint voice echoed through the maze, soft and lilting. "Over here." "That's Carly," Voss whispered. The two exchanged a grim look before following the sound. The throne of flesh. They found Carly in the heart of the labyrinth. She knelt before a grotesque throne that appeared to have grown from the floor itself, its form composed of bones, muscle, and sinew. The seat pulsed with a faint, sickly light, as though it housed something alive. Carly's hands were clasped in prayer, her head bowed as she whispered to the throne. "No," Reed barked, raising his weapon. "Step away from that thing." She didn't move. Instead, she looked up, her face serene, her eyes glassy. "Do you feel it?" she murmured. "The connection? It's not just a room, Reed. It's a piece of something bigger." "What the hell are you talking about?" Reed demanded. Curly gestured to the walls, which seemed to ripple in response. "SCP-2 isn't just collecting us. It's shaping us, designing us. It's trying to rebuild what it once was. A piece of a greater being scattered across dimensions. It's calling us to complete it." "Snap out of it, Carly." Reed took a step forward, but the floor beneath him trembled. A fleshy tendril shot out, nearly wrapping around his ankle. He dodged, narrowly avoiding being dragged into the wall. "Reed, stop," Voss shouted, pulling him back. "This place isn't stable." The maze shifts. The labyrinth began to change. Walls shifted, corridors closed, and new pathways opened in an organic cascade of pulsating flesh. The maze was alive, and it was trapping them inside. "We're not getting out the same way we came in," Voss said, her voice tight with urgency. Carly turned to them, her expression distant. "It won't let you leave unless it wants you to. It's part of the process." Ignoring her, Voss pressed a hand against the wall, feeling its rhythmic pulse. "It's like a heartbeat," she muttered, her mind racing. "If we can follow the rhythm, track the origin, we might be able to find an exit." Reed grabbed her shoulder. "You're guessing." "I'm hypothesizing," she snapped. "And unless you have a better idea, shut up and listen." Guided by the heartbeat, they began navigating the shifting corridors. The walls seemed to resist their movements, tendrils lashing out and trying to pull them back. Reed fired into the walls as they moved, the wet splatter of organic matter mingling with the deafening hum. The escape attempt. The hum grew louder, almost deafening, as they neared what Voss believed was the center of SCP-2. Tendrils lashed out faster, more violently, nearly catching Reed as he stumbled. Voss grabbed his arm, pulling him forward. Finally, they reached a faint opening, a jagged tear in the flesh-like material. Beyond it was a faint light, a potential escape. "Go!" Voss shouted. Reed turned back to see Carly still kneeling by the throne, her body limp and unresponsive. For a brief moment he hesitated, torn between saving her and escaping. But the walls began closing in, the maze collapsing around them. "She's gone, Reed," Voss shouted, pulling him through the opening. The two of them tumbled out into the cool night air, gasping for breath as the entrance to SCP-2 sealed itself behind them. The structure was silent now, its pulsations muted as though it had retreated into dormancy. The cost. Reed and Voss sat in silence, staring at the grotesque structure that had nearly consumed them. Carly was gone, and the maze had left its scars, not just physically, but mentally. "She knew too much," Reed said finally, his voice hollow. "And it cost her." Voss nodded, her mind racing with new, terrifying questions. SCP-2 wasn't just a collector. It was a creator. And whatever it was building, they had barely scratched the surface of its purpose. As the night deepened, a faint hum began to echo once more from SCP-2, like a heartbeat in the dark. Chapter 4. The Collector's Call. The night was unnervingly silent. The hum of SCP-2 had faded, leaving an oppressive stillness that hung in the air like a weight. Dr. Elara Voss and Agent Malcolm Reed sat in the observation tent, neither speaking, both haunted by the events inside the anomaly. The faint glow of floodlights barely cut through the suffocating darkness, casting long, flickering shadows that seemed to stretch and writhe unnaturally. The hallucinations begin. Voss rubbed her temples, exhaustion etched into her features. "It's still in my head," she murmured. Reed, pacing like a caged animal, shot her a glance. "What are you talking about?" She hesitated, then met his gaze. "It's like it's still calling to me, whispering things I can't quite understand." Reed opened his mouth to respond, but the words died on his lips as a shadow flitted across the tent. He spun around, weapon raised, but found nothing. "Reed?" Voss's voice was uneasy. "I thought I saw—" He stopped short, his breath hitching. Standing in the corner of the tent was a figure he recognized all too well, a young boy with dark hair and wide, innocent eyes. His son, the one he hadn't been able to save. "Dad," the boy said, his voice trembling. Reed froze, his grip on his weapon faltering. "No," he whispered. "You're not real." Meanwhile, Voss stared at the empty air Reed seemed to be fixated on, her heart pounding. Then she saw it, her own nightmare materializing before her. A man in a lab coat, his face twisted in agony, his arms reaching for her as blood dripped from his mouth. "You let us die," he hissed. "You knew what it would do to us." Voss whispered, backing away. "I didn't know. I didn't—" The tent was alive with shadows and whispers, SCP-2's influence invading their minds, dredging up their deepest fears and regrets. The anomaly was feeding on them, its hunger as psychological as it was physical. The betrayal. As the hallucinations intensified, Carly's voice cut through the madness, startling them both. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Reed and Voss turned to see Carly standing at the entrance to the tent. Her face was calm, her expression almost serene, but her eyes were filled with something wild and unrecognizable. "Carly," Voss stammered, "how are you here?" "You wasn't lost," Carly interrupted, stepping closer. "I was chosen. It showed me the truth." Reed aimed his weapon at her. "Don't move. You've been compromised." Carly laughed softly, the sound chilling. "Compromised? No, Agent Reed. I'm enlightened, don't you see? SCP-2 isn't just some mindless anomaly. It's a piece of something extraordinary. Something that wants us to be part of it." "Part of it?" Voss repeated, her voice cracking. "It kills people, Carly. It consumes them." "No," Carly said, her tone almost pitying. "It transforms them. It gives them purpose. And it's so much more than just flesh. It feeds on emotion, on connection. That's why it showed you both what you fear most. It needs you to give yourselves willingly." Reed's grip on his weapon tightened. "What are you saying?" Carly's smile widened. "It needs a sacrifice, and I think it's time I helped fulfill its vision." Before they could react, Carly lunged for Reed, knocking the weapon from his hands. She moved with an unnatural strength, fueled by SCP-2's influence. Voss scrambled to grab a tranquilizer gun from her kit, but Carly was too fast. She grabbed a scalpel and pressed it to Voss's throat. "Do you feel it, Eleanor?" Carly whispered. "Do you feel its call?" The truth comes out. Reed recovered his weapon and aimed it at Carly. "Let her go." Carly's gaze shifted to him, her expression unbothered. "You won't shoot me, Reed. You're as much a part of this as I am. And Voss, she's known the truth all along." Voss's eyes widened. "What are you talking about?" Carly laughed again, the sound sharp and cruel. "You studied it, didn't you? Before any of us even knew it existed, you ran experiments. You knew what it could do." Reed's gaze snapped to Voss. "Is that true?" Voss hesitated, shame washing over her. I suspected SCP-2 wasn't isolated. I thought it might be connected to a larger anomaly, something spanning dimensions. I didn't have proof. The Foundation wouldn't have allowed me to investigate without results. So I ran tests." "On people," Reed demanded. Voss closed her eyes, her voice barely a whisper. "They volunteered. They didn't know what they were signing up for. I didn't think it would come to this." Reed's face darkened with anger and betrayal. "You knew this thing was dangerous, and you didn't say anything. How many people died because of you?" "I was trying to stop it." Voss shot back, her voice trembling. "I thought if I understood it, I could contain it. I didn't know it would consume them," Carly finished, her voice mocking. "You're no better than it is, Eleanor. You're part of its design." The collapse. The hum of SCP-2 returned, louder than ever. The ground beneath their feet trembled as tendrils burst through the floor of the tent, reaching for them. Reed acted quickly, firing at Carly's shoulder and causing her to drop the scalpel. Voss broke free, grabbing the tranquilizer gun and shooting Carly in the neck. Carly collapsed, unconscious, as the tendrils retreated. Reed turned to Voss, his expression unreadable. "You've got a lot to answer for, Doctor." Voss nodded, her face pale. "I know." As the hum grew louder, the two of them dragged Carly's unconscious body out of the tent. Behind them, SCP-2 pulsed and writhed, its hunger unabated, and in the back of their minds, both Reed and Voss could still hear its whispers, calling them back. Chapter 5. The Flesh Throne. The hum of SCP-2 had risen to a deafening roar, reverberating through the ground and into the hearts of everyone still alive in the containment facility. Lights flickered erratically, casting long shadows across the camp as SCP-2 grew exponentially, its grotesque flesh creeping outward like an infection. What had once been a room was now a massive cathedral-like structure, pulsating with malevolent intent. Reed and Voss stood at the threshold of the anomaly, weapons in hand, their faces pale but resolute. Beyond the warped entrance they could see the full horror of SCP-2's interior, walls lined with sculptures of human remains, furniture twisted from sinew and bone, and at the center, a throne that seemed to breathe. Carly Nguyen stood before it, her body almost unrecognizable, her arms outstretched as if in worship. Confrontation. "Carly!" Reed shouted, his voice barely audible over the cacophony. "Get away from it!" She turned to face them, her once bright eyes now dull and bloodshot, her skin pale and stretched thin. "It's too late," she said, her voice echoing unnaturally. "You can't stop it now. It's awakening." "Carly, listen to me," Voss pleaded. "This thing isn't awakening, it's consuming. It's using you." "No," Carly said, her tone serene. "It's creating. Don't you see? It's rebuilding itself, a piece of something far greater, something beyond us. You can't destroy it." Reed raised his weapon, his jaw tight. "Maybe not, but we can damn well try." He fired, the shot striking the throne's base. The structure groaned, flesh rippling outward like water disturbed by a stone. Tendrils lashed out in retaliation, one narrowly missing Voss as she dove aside. "The fail-safe." Voss scrambled to her feet, her eyes scanning the room. "Reed, the containment system. It's designed to cut off dimensional connections. If we trigger the fail-safe..." "We blow the whole place to hell," Reed finished grimly. Voss nodded. "It's the only way to stop it from spreading." The two moved quickly, dodging the thrashing tendrils as they made their way to the control panel embedded in the flesh-like wall. It was partially assimilated, its mechanical parts fused with organic tissue, but the fail-safe mechanism was still operational. Voss worked furiously to bypass the corrupted systems, her fingers trembling as she typed. Carly approached them slowly, her body moving unnaturally as though controlled by SCP-2 itself. "You can't stop it," she whispered. "It's already won." Reed stepped between Carly and Voss, his weapon trained on her. "Stay back, Carly. Don't make me do this." Carly tilted her head, a sad smile on her lips. "I'm already part of it, Malcolm. You'll see, one way or another." A tendril shot toward Voss, but Carly stepped into its path, letting it pierce her chest. She gasped, blood spilling from her mouth, but she remained standing, her body trembling. "Do it," she rasped. "Destroy it." The collapse. With Carly's sacrifice distracting SCP-2, Voss managed to trigger the failsafe. A low, mechanical whine filled the air as the containment system began to overload. The walls of SCP-2 shuddered, its pulsations becoming erratic as it struggled against the containment field's growing power. "Reed, we have to go," Voss shouted, grabbing his arm. He hesitated, his gaze lingering on Carly as the tendrils began to pull her into the throne. "Munyen?" the native woman asked. "Munyen Mien?" "Graciously," interrupted him. "Graciously." "Now!" Voss screamed, yanking him away. The two fled, the ground collapsing behind them as SCP-2 imploded. The fleshy walls folded inward, the throne disintegrating into a mass of writhing tendrils and bone. A blinding light consumed the structure as the containment system severed SCP-2's dimensional tether. Reed and Voss burst out of the collapsing anomaly, diving to the ground as the structure caved in on itself. When the dust settled, SCP-2 was gone. In its place was a gaping, scorched crater. The aftermath. The two sat in silence, their faces streaked with dirt and blood. Reed stared at the crater, his expression unreadable. "She didn't have to die," he said quietly. "She made her choice," Voss replied, though her voice was hollow. "She saw the truth about SCP-2. She knew it had to end. Reed turned to her, his eyes sharp. "And what about you, Voss? How much of the truth are you planning to tell?" She hesitated, the weight of her guilt heavy on her shoulders. "People need to know what's out there, what we're dealing with. And risk the Foundation coming after you?" "After us," Reed shook his head. "You don't know what they'll do to keep this under wraps." "Don't care," Voss said firmly. "This thing isn't the end. It's a piece of something bigger. If we don't prepare, if we don't warn people, they'll kill you," Reed interrupted. "Think about that before you decide to play whistleblower." Voss didn't respond. Instead, she stared at the horizon, where the first light of dawn was breaking. "We'll see," she murmured. SCP-3 Biological Motherboard. Chapter 1. Awakening. The descent into the Mariana Trench was a journey into the unknown, a plunge into the abyss where light faded and the weight of the ocean crushed all but the most resilient. Dr. Elara Voss sat in silence, her breathing steady despite the growing pressure around the submarine as it neared Arteon Station. Outside the porthole, bioluminescent creatures flickered and glided through the inky blackness like ghostly lanterns. "Welcome to the edge of the world," the pilot murmured as the station loomed into view. A behemoth of reinforced steel and glass, Archeon Station was anchored to the seafloor by massive supports, its exterior glowing faintly in the darkness. Despite its size, it felt fragile, as though it could be swallowed whole by the abyss at any moment. The docking process was seamless. The hiss of pressurized air greeted her as the submarine connected to the station's entry bay. Dr. Voss adjusted her lab coat, collected her datapad, and stepped into the dimly lit corridors of Archeon Station. The air inside was cool and sterile, carrying the faint hum of machinery. A young technician greeted her with a nervous smile. "Dr. Voss, welcome. The team is waiting in the briefing room." In the briefing room, a holographic projection of SCP-3 dominated the table. The artifact resembled an ancient, disc-like structure, its surface a chaotic blend of metallic and organic textures. Strange symbols, seemingly etched by an alien hand, pulsed faintly along its circumference. Dr. Voss studied the projection, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. Dr. Malcolm Trask, the station's grizzled head of research, gestured to the hologram. "This is SCP-3, or as we call it, the Catalyst. Discovered buried beneath Antarctic ice decades ago, it's alive, part machine, part organic. Its growth is triggered by heat, and once it starts growing, it assimilates and transforms any surrounding material." Dr. Trask tapped the console, and the hologram shifted to show a simulation of SCP-3's growth. In the simulation, the artifact absorbed its containment chamber, converting it into a nightmarish blend of flesh and metal. "To keep it dormant, we've contained it in a cryostatic unit. Temperature control is critical. A rise of even 1 degree could trigger exponential growth." Dr. Voss frowned. "What happens if it grows beyond containment?" "It doesn't stop, it evolves. We've only ever observed fragments of its capabilities, but if it breaches containment, the consequences would be catastrophic." Later that evening, Dr. Voss stood in the observation chamber, her gaze fixed on the real SCP-3. Encased in a cylindrical cryochamber, the artifact pulsed faintly like a heartbeat. She couldn't shake the feeling that it was alive, in a way far beyond what anyone understood. The room's lights flickered suddenly, and a loud hum resonated through the station. An alarm blared, and her comm unit crackled to life. "Power surge in Sector 4. Containment unit compromised." Dr. Voss sprinted to the control room, her heart pounding. On the monitors, SCP-3's cryochamber was no longer stable. The temperature inside had risen by 2 degrees. In horror, she watched as the artifact began to expand, tendrils of metallic organic material spilling out of the chamber. The transformation was swift and horrifying. Walls, machinery, and even the flooring began to twist into grotesque new forms, a blend of smooth metal and pulsating flesh. "Seal off the containment chamber," Dr. Trask shouted, his voice barely audible over the alarms. "Spreading too fast," one of the technicians yelled. "We're losing control of the systems. SCP-3 is integrating with the station's infrastructure." Dr. Voss gritted her teeth. "Shut down power to this sector. Starve it." The technicians scrambled to follow her orders, but it was too late. The station's lights dimmed further as SCP-3's growth began to interfere with the electrical grid. Panels in the control room flickered, displaying erratic streams of data. Dr. Voss clenched her fists. "If we can't stop it, we need to slow it down. What's the backup containment protocol?" "There isn't one," Dr. Trask admitted grimly. "We were assured the cryostatic system would be infallible." The crew worked through the night, battling the encroaching growth. Sections of the station became inaccessible, their hallways transformed into pulsating, alien structures. Dr. Voss couldn't shake the sense that SCP-3 was testing them, probing their weaknesses. Its growth wasn't random, it was deliberate. By dawn, the containment unit was unrecognizable. SCP-3 had fully integrated with the surrounding systems. The artifact pulsed with a disturbing rhythm, and faint whispers began to echo through the station. Dr. Voss wasn't sure if they were real or a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. She glanced at Dr. Trask. "This isn't just an artifact, it's something else, something aware." Dr. Trask nodded grimly. "And now it's part of us." The crew fell silent as SCP-3 continued to grow, reshaping Archeon Station into its own image. Chapter 2. The Transformation. The air inside Archeon Station had grown heavy, carrying an unnatural warmth that should not have existed so deep in the ocean. The metallic walls of the corridors had begun to twist and ripple, as though alive, veins of glowing organic material threading through the structure. Lights flickered erratically, and faint whispers echoed from nowhere. Dr. Elara Voss stood at the intersection of two warped hallways, her jaw tight as she took in the grotesque changes. What had once been sleek, sterile pathways were now grotesque, biomechanical tunnels. Metal panels pulsed like living skin, and strange root-like tendrils writhed along the ceiling. "What the hell is happening to this place?" asked Lieutenant Adrian Hayes, the head of station security. His team of armed officers stood behind him, their expressions a mixture of dread and resolve. "SCP-3 is rewriting the station structure," Dr. Voss replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "It's adapting, evolving, and it's not just the environment. We're next." The group pushed deeper into the station, their flashlights cutting through the flickering dimness. Along the way, they passed abandoned tools and overturned furniture, the signs of chaos left by those who had fled the spreading growth. A faint, low hum resonated through the air, accompanied by the occasional crackle of static in their comm units. Dr. Voss paused at an intersection, her datapad blinking with alerts. She pulled up a map of the station, overlaying it with thermal readings. "The surge that triggered this, it wasn't random. The energy spike originated in the auxiliary control hub. Someone tampered with the system." "Are you saying this was sabotage?" Hayes asked. Voss nodded grimly. "There's no other explanation." As they approached the auxiliary hub, the team began to experience strange phenomena. Shadows seemed to move on their own, stretching unnaturally long across the walls. Whispers echoed in their ears, familiar voices murmuring words they couldn't understand. Lieutenant Hayes froze, his weapon raised, when he heard a child's laugh behind him. "Did anyone else hear that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The group exchanged uneasy glances. "Stay together," Voss said firmly. "It's SCP-3. It's trying to manipulate us." They reached the auxiliary hub, but the sight waiting for them made several of the officers recoil. The room had been overtaken by SCP-3's influence. What was once a control center now resembled a hive, with organic metallic structures protruding from the walls. Panels oozed a viscous glowing liquid, and cables twisted like serpents. In the center of the room was the most horrifying sight. A member of the engineering crew, fused into the machinery. The man's body had been grotesquely altered, his limbs elongated and interwoven with metal tendrils. His face was stretched and distorted, his mouth opening and closing as though he were trying to speak. A faint, garbled noise escaped his throat, a mix of static and a low moan. "Is he alive?" one of the officers asked, his voice trembling. Dr. Voss crouched to examine the man, her hands shaking slightly. She scanned his vitals with her datapad, and the results made her stomach churn. "He's alive, but only barely. SCP-3 is using him, repurposing his biology to fuel its growth." Lieutenant Hayes grimaced. "We need to move. If it's doing this to people—" Voss nodded, pulling encrypted data logs from the corrupted consoles. "I'll analyze these later. Let's keep moving." As the team continued their investigation, more crew members disappeared. Their search led them to another nightmarish discovery, a makeshift containment area where several of the missing crew were fused into the walls, their bodies partially transformed. Metallic veins coursed through their skin, and their eyes glowed faintly. They murmured incoherently, their voices overlapping in a chilling mechanical harmony. Dr. Voss approached one of them, her datapad in hand. "This isn't random," she said, her voice trembling with realization. "SCP-3 isn't just growing, it's learning. It's integrating the station's systems and us into its design." "What does it want?" Hayes asked. Voss hesitated. "Survival? Domination? We don't know enough, but it's becoming clear that SCP-3 isn't just an artifact. It's alive, and it's intelligent." Back in the lab, Voss studied the encrypted data logs she had recovered. The files were fragmented, but the information she pieced together chilled her to the core. SCP-3 had been discovered, not created. It predated humanity, possibly by millions of years. The logs hinted at an ancient extraterrestrial civilization that had either built or encountered SCP-3. The artifact's purpose remained unclear, but the logs referred to it as a seed, capable of transforming entire ecosystems. Dr. Voss leaned back in her chair, her thoughts racing. If SCP-3 was a seed, then Archeon Station was its soil, and it was beginning to bloom. The station's transformation continued unabated, and the survivors were running out of options. As the boundaries between machine, flesh, and reality blurred, Dr. Voss couldn't shake the feeling that they were playing into SCP-3's hands, or whatever passed for hands in its unfathomable design. Whatever SCP-3 was planning, it was far from finished. Chapter 3: Descent into Chaos. The station groaned like a dying beast, the sound reverberating through the twisted biomechanical corridors. Dr. Elara Voss clung to a handrail as another tremor rocked the facility. Monitors flickered, displaying corrupted streams of data interspersed with alien symbols. The air was stifling, tinged with an acrid metallic taste, and her oxygen meter blinked red, warning of the thinning atmosphere. "We're losing life support," Lieutenant Hayes announced grimly, scanning the room. "If we don't act soon, there won't be anyone left to save." Dr. Voss nodded, wiping sweat from her brow. "The station's systems are fully compromised. SCP-3 isn't just spreading, it's consuming everything, including the environment. At this rate, the pressure shields will fail, and the ocean will crush us." The survivors, now reduced to a handful of engineers, scientists, and security personnel, had gathered in the operations hub. The room, though partially overrun by SCP-3's growth, was one of the few areas still functional. A tense silence filled the space as the gravity of their situation settled over them. Factions divide. The fragile unity of the group shattered when Hayes slammed his fist on the table. "We need to destroy SCP-3 now. We've got experimental charges in storage. We plant them, detonate, and sink this station before it gets any further." A scientist, Dr. Damaris Cho, shook her head vehemently. "You can't be serious. If you blow the station, you risk scattering SCP-3's fragments across the trench. What if that accelerates its growth? We need to leave, quarantine the site, and let the surface teams handle it." "Handle it how?" Hayes snapped. If it breaches containment and reaches the surface, it'll devour everything. Do you want to be responsible for ending life on Earth? The room erupted into argument, voices rising and overlapping. Dr. Voss stepped between the two factions, raising her hands. Enough! Her voice cut through the chaos. We don't have time for this. Every second we waste arguing brings us closer to SCP-3 achieving whatever it's trying to do. SCP-3's influence. As tensions flared, the station's changes became more pronounced. Walls writhed as though breathing, and a low, rhythmic pulse resonated through the air. It was a sound that wasn't just heard but felt, deep within the chest, like an alien heartbeat. Then came the screams. The group rushed to a nearby hallway, only to find a security officer, Davis, writhing on the floor. His body convulsed as tendrils of metallic organic material burst from his skin, latching onto the walls. His face twisted in agony, then went blank. When his eyes opened again, they glowed with an eerie, unnatural light. Davis rose, his movements jerky, his body partially fused with SCP-3's tendrils. "Join us," he said, his voice distorted, layered with a metallic undertone. "It's not the end, it's the beginning." Several more crew members fell under SCP-3's control, their minds and bodies warped into extensions of its will. The survivors retreated to the operations hub, barricading the doors as the infected clawed and pounded from the other side, uncovering the truth. Dr. Voss pored over the encrypted data logs she had salvaged earlier. The symbols and fragments of text began to make sense now, forming a grim picture. SCP-3 was no mere artifact. It was a biological machine designed to adapt and consume. Its purpose, encoded into its very structure, was to replicate itself and terraform its surroundings to support its growth. Her hands trembled as she turned to Hayes. "It's a seed," she said, her voice hollow. "It's not just growing, it's preparing. It's adapting to this environment, but it's meant for the surface. If it gets there, it will integrate with the biosphere and rewrite the planet itself." Hayes grimaced. "Then we have no choice. We destroy the station." A desperate plan. After hours of deliberation, the group settled on a desperate plan. They would reach the central reactor, located in the heart of the station, and trigger a self-destruct sequence. The reactor's core, once overloaded, would generate a thermal explosion powerful enough to obliterate the station and, hopefully, SCP-3. "We're working against time," Voss said as she gathered supplies. "The longer we wait, the more SCP-3 will fight back." Hayes armed his team with makeshift weapons and experimental charges, their original purpose long forgotten in the chaos. The survivors set out, navigating the warped corridors of the station. The path to the reactor was perilous, with SCP-3's infected blocking their way. Chaos escalates. The station's integrity continued to deteriorate. Pressure levels fluctuated dangerously, and the oxygen supply dropped further. SCP-3's tendrils reached into every corner, pulsating with a sinister rhythm. The survivors fought their way through the labyrinth of biomechanical horrors, losing several members to ambushes and traps set by the infected. Dr. Voss led the group through a detour, using her knowledge of the station's layout to avoid the worst of SCP-3's growths. Along the way, she noticed something unsettling. SCP-3 seemed to anticipate their moves, as though it were watching. When they finally reached the reactor, they found it partially overrun. The core pulsed with the same organic, metallic growths that consumed the rest of the station. Voss stepped forward, her gaze fixed on the console. "We're here. Let's finish this." As she began entering the override codes, the reactor room filled with an unnatural sound. A low, guttural voice that seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere. "You cannot destroy what is inevitable," it said, chilling them to the bone. The group exchanged nervous glances as the realization set in. SCP-3 wasn't just a seed, it was sentient, and it wasn't going down without a fight. Chapter 4. The Catalyst's Will. The descent into the station's lower levels was like entering the maw of a living beast. Walls that had once been smooth steel were now grotesque amalgamations of flesh and metal. Tendrils writhed along the ceilings, pulsing with an ominous rhythm, and faint whispers seemed to rise from the very walls, their voices overlapping in an incomprehensible symphony. The deeper the survivors ventured, the more alien the station became. Dr. Elara Voss led the way, clutching her datapad like a talisman. Behind her, Lieutenant Hayes and the remaining members of the group moved cautiously, weapons raised. Every shadow, every flicker of movement was a potential threat. They all knew by now that SCP-3 wasn't just spreading, it was alive, and it was watching them. The monstrosities in the hive. Their path to the reactor was fraught with danger. The corridors had transformed into a labyrinth of warped passageways and dead ends, forcing them to navigate blind. Biomechanical monstrosities lurked in the shadows, creatures that had once been crew members, now fused with SCP-3's growth. One moment they resembled shambling humanoids, the next they morphed into insect-like forms, skittering along the walls and ceilings. The team fought valiantly, but their resources were dwindling. Each encounter left them more battered, more desperate. At one point, a gaping chasm opened beneath their feet, revealing a pulsating network of organic cables far below. Dr. Voss realized that SCP-3 had fully integrated with the station's power grid, drawing energy directly from the reactor. "This isn't just growth," she murmured. "It's evolving. It's adapting to every obstacle we throw at it." Fractured trust. The group's unity began to crumble. Exhaustion, fear, and the station's relentless transformation took their toll. Accusations flew as paranoia set in. "How do we know someone here isn't already under its control?" one of the engineers snapped, her voice trembling. "We've seen what it can do." "I'm not infected," another retorted. "But how do we know you're not?" Lieutenant Hayes stepped between them, his weapon raised. "Enough. If we turn on each other now, we won't make it to the reactor." Dr. Voss tried to refocus the group. "SCP-3 wants this. It's manipulating us. Stay together. We're the only chance we have to stop." The message. As they pressed on, Dr. Voss's datapad pinged with an alert. She paused, frowning at the screen. "Wait. There's something embedded in the structure. Data packets. It's been hiding in the station's systems." "What does that mean?" Hayes asked, peering over her shoulder. "It means SCP-3 has been communicating all along," Voss replied, her fingers flying across the datapad. As she decrypted the message, a chilling realization struck her. The symbols weren't random, they formed a coherent language, one that her algorithms could translate. The message was both simple and terrifying. "You are being tested. Prove your worth, or be replaced." Voss felt a cold shiver run down her spine. "It's sentient. It's not just growing. It's evaluating us. Humanity." SCP-3's offer. The group reached the final stretch before the reactor, a vast chamber that had been entirely consumed by SCP-3. The walls pulsed with light, casting eerie shadows across the floor. As they stepped inside, a deep, resonant voice echoed through the chamber. It wasn't spoken, it was felt, resonating in their bones. "Elara Voss," the voice said, sending chills down her spine. "You understand. You see. Join me." Voss froze. "What is?" she whispered. "I am the seed, the architect, the evolution." The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "Your kind is weak, scattered. I will unify you, reshape you, merge with me, and you will guide this new world." The rest of the group stared at her, their faces pale. "Don't listen to it," Hayes barked. "It's trying to manipulate you." Voss's mind raced. The proposition was terrifying, but there was a seductive logic to it. SCP-3 wasn't just a threat, it was a force of nature, and forces of nature were nearly impossible to stop. "What happens if I refuse?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Extinction. The reactor." The team pushed forward, reaching the reactor core. The sight before them was overwhelming. What should have been a pristine, controlled environment was now a nightmarish hive. Tendrils snaked around the reactor, pumping a luminous fluid into its systems. The core pulsed with SCP-3's influence, its surface covered in the same alien symbols Voss had decoded earlier. Hayes began setting the charges, but the task was far from simple. SCP-3's growth interfered with their equipment, shorting circuits and disabling timers. Voss worked frantically to override the corrupted systems, but every step forward was met with new obstacles. Then saboteurs revealed themselves. One of the engineers, his eyes glowing faintly with SCP-3's influence, lunged at the group, smashing one of the charges. "You can't destroy it," he screamed, his voice distorted. "It's the future." Hayes tackled him, but the delay cost them precious time. The infected engineer fought with inhuman strength, forcing the others to intervene. In the chaos, another charge was damaged, leaving them with barely enough firepower to trigger a chain reaction. The catalyst's final move. As the group struggled to complete the sabotage, the chamber itself began to shift. The floor cracked and heaved, revealing a massive, pulsating core beneath the reactor, a physical manifestation of SCP-3's will. The air grew thick, and the voice returned, louder and more forceful. "You cannot stop me. Join or perish." Dr. Voss hesitated, her hands hovering over the console. Could they even stop this thing? Was it worth the sacrifice? The team's lives and humanity's future hung in the balance. "Voss," Hayes shouted, "we're out of time. Make the call." With a deep breath, she made her decision, her fingers flying over the keys to initiate the reactor's overload. But SCP-3 wasn't finished. As the reactor whirred to life, its tendrils surged, threatening to shut it down. The station was seconds away from its breaking point. All that remained was to see if humanity's last stand would be enough. Chapter 5. The Final Hour. The reactor core groaned and hissed, its surface warped by SCP-3's encroaching tendrils. Pulsating veins of glowing biometal wrapped around the machinery, feeding energy back into the artifact's growing structure. The countdown clock on the console ticked down relentlessly, each second a reminder of how little time remained. Dr. Elara Voss stood at the control terminal, her hands trembling as she struggled to find a solution. The team worked frantically around her, setting the remaining charges and holding off SCP-3's monstrosities as best they could. Every step forward seemed to come at a terrible cost. "This reactor isn't going to be enough," Lieutenant Hayes said, his voice rough from exhaustion. "SCP-3 is integrated too deeply. The detonation might just feed it." Voss's mind raced. "No, not if we overload it. If we push the reactor past critical, the energy surge could destabilize SCP-3's structure." She looked up, meeting Hayes' eyes. "But it's going to take everything we've got, and we won't have time to get clear." The team exchanged grim looks. They all understood what was being asked of them. The final push. As Voss recalibrated the reactor's systems, SCP-3 responded with an almost sentient rage. The floor beneath them heaved, throwing one of the engineers off balance. He screamed as SCP-3's tendrils dragged him into the walls, his body consumed in seconds. The room filled with the sound of twisting metal and a deep, resonant hum that seemed to penetrate their very bones. "Keep it together," Hayes shouted, firing his weapon at an advancing monstrosity. The bullets slowed it down, but only barely. "Voss, how much longer?" "I need 5 more minutes," she yelled back, her fingers flying across the console. Sweat dripped down her forehead as she bypassed corrupted systems and rerouted power to the reactor core. The remaining charges were placed around the core's vulnerable points. The team had to fight tooth and nail to protect them, sacrificing more lives as SCP-3's creations swarmed the room. The air grew thick with heat and smoke, the reactor's containment systems struggling to hold under the strain. A terrible choice. As Voss neared completion, SCP-3's voice returned, louder and more forceful than ever. "Elara Voss, you see the futility. Your kind will fail." The alien intelligence seemed to pour into her mind, showing her visions of what it could create. A perfect world, free of chaos and entropy. "Merge with me. Together we will ascend." For a moment Voss faltered. The offer was tempting in its own twisted way. Could she guide SCP-3, reshape its purpose, and save humanity from destruction? Or was this just another manipulation? She shook her head, forcing herself to focus. "You're not saving us. You're erasing us," she muttered. The sacrifice. "Dr. Voss!" Hayes's shout broke through her thoughts. "We're out of time." The charges were armed, and the reactor was nearing overload. SCP-3's tendrils lashed out violently, ripping through one of the support beams. The structure groaned, and a tremor shook the room. Voss turned to the others, her heart sinking. "Go, get to the escape pods." Hayes stared at her. "We won't make it, and you know it." One by one the survivors nodded, grimly accepting their fate. "Then let's make this count," Hayes said, taking up a defensive position by the door. As the team held off the advancing monstrosities, Voss made a final decision. She removed her helmet and stepped toward the reactor, allowing SCP-3's tendrils to brush her skin. The alien intelligence flooded her mind, a maelstrom of incomprehensible thoughts and visions. She gasped, her consciousness teetering on the edge. But she used the connection to her advantage. With SCP-3 distracted, she sent a surge of energy through the reactor's systems, bypassing its final safeguards. The overload was now irreversible. "You could have been more..." SCP-3's voice echoed, laced with what sounded like disappointment. Voss smirked, her strength fading. "Humanity's good enough." The implosion. The reactor's core erupted in a blinding surge of energy, the shockwave tearing through the station. Tendrils shriveled and disintegrated, SCP-3's monstrous creations collapsing into lifeless heaps. The station itself crumbled as the overload consumed it, the immense pressure of the ocean rushing in to finish the job. In her final moments, Voss felt a strange calm. The fragment of SCP-3 within her mind faded, its voice silenced by the roaring energy. Aftermath. Hours later, the surface world remained blissfully unaware of the near-apocalyptic event that had unfolded miles below. A research vessel, responding to an automated distress beacon, arrived at the site of the imploded station. Amid the debris, the crew found remnants of SCP-3. The fragment was dormant, its surface dark and lifeless. "Bag it up," the lead researcher ordered, unaware of what they were handling. "HQ will want to study this." As the fragment was lifted aboard, it pulsed faintly, just once, as if it were waiting. SCP-4. The 12 Rusty Keys and the Door. Chapter 1. The Discovery. Overhaven was the kind of town where life moved at a leisurely pace. Nestled in the rolling hills of the Midwest, its cobblestone streets and red brick buildings hadn't changed much since the late 1800s. Yet the looming shadow of the old bellwether factory on the outskirts served as a grim reminder of Overhaven's industrial past. Long abandoned, its broken windows and rusted machinery were a favorite haunt for local teenagers who dared each other to explore its eerie halls. It was a sweltering summer evening when a group of 5 teenagers decided to test their bravery. Jonah, the ringleader, led the way with a flashlight, flanked by his best friends Mary, Sam, and the inseparable twins Lila and Liam. The group squeezed through a hole in the chain-link fence and made their way to the factory's derelict interior. Dust motes hung in the air like tiny specters as the teens stumbled upon a peculiar sight, a heavy, weathered wooden door standing inexplicably in the middle of a large room. Around its base lay 12 ancient-looking keys, each one stained with rust and grime. A single word, "Boundary," was etched into the door's surface in faded letters. "Do you think it's locked?" Jonah mused, crouching down to pick up one of the keys. The others hesitated, a collective sense of unease settling over them. Maybe we shouldn't mess with it, Mary said, clutching her flashlight tighter. Jonah smirked. Come on, Mary. It's just an old door. What's the worst that could happen? Inciting. Jonah selected a key at random and slid it into the door's keyhole. The metal resisted at first, but with a little force it clicked into place. He turned the key, grinning triumphantly. But nothing happened. Guess it's busted, Jonah muttered, withdrawing the key and tossing it aside. His friends began to relax, their laughter bouncing off the cavernous walls. Yet Jonah's curiosity burned brighter. He picked up another key, this one with strange markings etched into its head, a series of jagged symbols that seemed to shimmer faintly in the dim light. Jonah, seriously, let's go, Sam urged. Ignoring the warning, Jonah inserted the key into the lock. This time, a deep, resonant click echoed through the room. The temperature plummeted, and the laughter died as an oppressive silence fell. Jonah's triumphant smile faltered. He tried to pull the key out, but his hand wouldn't move. His eyes widened in panic as an unseen force seemed to root him to the spot. Jonah! Mary screamed. Then the door let out a groaning creak, as if something on the other side was testing its strength. Jonah's body convulsed violently before he collapsed to the floor. His friends froze in horror as he lay there, his limbs contorted at unnatural angles, his eyes wide but unseeing. Hours later, when the authorities arrived, Jonah was still alive, but he wasn't the same. His skin was pallid, his veins dark, bulging. His mouth moved constantly, whispering nonsensical phrases. Yet, one coherent sentence surfaced again and again, and on the other side. What's on the other side? The Foundation. By morning, rumors of the incident had reached the SCP Foundation through their network of embedded informants. Overhaven's local authorities were soon silenced, their reports redacted, and the Bellwether factory was cordoned off under the guise of a hazardous materials investigation. Dr. Eliza Moran, a veteran researcher specializing in anomalous phenomena, was dispatched to lead the investigation. A no-nonsense scientist with a reputation for solving complex mysteries, she arrived with a small team of field agents and researchers. Jonah had been transferred to a secure Foundation facility, but his cryptic utterances remained a troubling enigma. As the team set up their equipment in the factory, Dr. Moran examined the door. The air around it felt heavy, almost charged, as if the very space it occupied defied natural laws. She noted the 12 keys scattered nearby, each one marked with unique, indecipherable symbols. Cliffhanger. Curiosity got the better of Dr. Moran. She picked up one of the keys and held it under the light. The symbols glowed faintly, just as Jonah had described in his mutterings. Against her better judgment, she inserted the key into the lock and turned it. The door groaned open, revealing an impossible sight. A void of swirling, pulsing light. The faint sound of whispers filled the air, unintelligible yet strangely compelling. The light seemed to stretch into infinity, defying the limits of the factory walls. Dr. Moran stepped back, her heart pounding. "Get the recording equipment," she ordered. But before her team could respond, a sudden gust of wind burst from the door, extinguishing the lights in the room. The whispers grew louder, and from the void, a shadow began to emerge. "Close it!" Moraine shouted, but her voice was nearly drowned out by the rising cacophony. The shadow moved closer, and with it came an overwhelming sense of dread. Something had noticed them, and it was coming through. "Would you like me to generate an image for this scene of the door opening to the void?" Chapter 2. The Other Side. An Exploration. The room was silent, except for the hum of equipment and the faint crackling of a radio feed. Dr. Moran and her team had set up a secure perimeter around the door, dubbed SCP-4, in the heart of the decrepit Bellwether factory. With the door ajar, the swirling void beyond it emitted an unsettling, iridescent glow, illuminating the dust-choked air. "Drone is ready," said Agent Ruiz, gripping the controls with white-knuckled tension. "Proceed," Dr. Moran replied, her voice calm but her eyes betraying her unease. The drone, a sleek black machine equipped with advanced sensors and cameras, whirred to life and floated through the open doorway. As it crossed the threshold, the video feed distorted, static briefly filling the monitors before a clear image emerged. The team watched in horrified fascination as the drone transmitted footage of a nightmarish expanse. The landscape was alien and incomprehensible, floating skeletal structures twisted and warped in impossible geometries. Vast towers of bone and metal spiraled into an orange-tinted sky, while rivers of molten liquid carved erratic patterns below. Shadows flitted across the scene, too fast and too distorted to identify. "How do those things?" whispered Dr. Patel, the team's lead biologist. "Focus," Moran snapped, though her own heart pounded in her chest. The drone's sensors detected faint organic signatures, but the data was erratic, as if the laws of physics themselves were unstable on the other side. Suddenly the video feed glitched, and a low guttural sound reverberated through the speakers, a sound that no one could identify but instinctively feared. "Pull it back," Moran ordered. Ruiz began to maneuver the drone back toward the door, but just as it neared the threshold, the feed cut out completely. The last image captured was a massive shadow stretching across the landscape, accompanied by an otherworldly screech. First casualty. The team regrouped, shaken but determined to understand what they had glimpsed. While they analyzed the fragmented data from the drone, Engineer Davis, a quiet but dependable technician, stood near the door, his gaze fixed on the swirling void. "Davis, step away from the door," Moran warned, noticing his trance-like state. He didn't respond. "Davis!" Ruiz barked, moving toward him. But before anyone could react, Davis stepped forward, his movements unnaturally smooth, as if guided by invisible strings. Moran shouted, lunging toward him, but it was too late. Davis crossed the threshold and vanished. The room filled with an ear-piercing shriek, followed by Davis's screams echoing back through the void. His cries were guttural, primal, and filled with unimaginable terror. Then, silence. The team stood frozen, the air heavy with dread. Ruiz slammed the door shut, his face pale. "What the hell just happened?" Patel whispered. Moran clenched her fists, her mind racing. It wasn't Davis. Something took control of him, unveiling the rules. Over the next 48 hours, the team conducted cautious experiments with the other keys. Each key, when used to open the door, revealed a different realm. Some were vast expanses of barren deserts under blood-red skies. Others were claustrophobic tunnels lined with pulsating organic walls. One key opened to a realm entirely submerged in liquid, the surface glittering with bioluminescent life forms. But with every test, the team noticed consistent phenomena. Time moved differently on the other side, and the entities glimpsed in the various dimensions seemed aware of their presence. The door wasn't merely a gateway, it was a beacon. Dr. Moran meticulously catalogued the properties of each key, but the deeper they delved, the more dangerous their work became. The door began to hum softly, almost like a pulse, as if it were alive and growing stronger. Tension rises. Meanwhile, Jonah's condition worsened. Though his body remained restrained in a Foundation medical facility, his whispers grew louder and more coherent. He began speaking in a guttural, alien language that no linguist could decipher. At times, his voice would shift, becoming deep and resonant, like multiple beings speaking in unison. Dr. Moran visited Jonah during a brief return to the facility, hoping to glean some insight. As she stood by his bed, his eyes snapped open, locking onto hers with unnerving intensity. "You've opened the door too many times," he hissed, his voice layered with a malevolent resonance. "They are watching now. They are coming." "Who's coming?" Moran demanded. Jonah's body convulsed, his voice turning to a whisper. "The architects. The forgotten ones. You must Lock the door. His breathing slowed, and he fell unconscious, leaving Moran with more questions than answers. Cliffhanger. Back at the factory, the team continued their experiments despite the rising tension. Moran herself was consumed by the cryptic warnings and the implications of what they had unleashed. She stared at the door, the 12 keys laid out before her, their symbols glowing faintly in the dim light. Against her better judgment, she picked up one of the keys and inserted it into the lock. The door creaked open, revealing yet another alien landscape. This time a wave of heat and ash rolled into the room, and in the distance a massive, spire-like structure loomed, surrounded by swirling black clouds. From the doorway came a low, rumbling growl that vibrated through the air. "What have we done?" Moran whispered as a colossal shadow began to move within the clouds, inching closer with every passing moment. Would you like an illustration of the drone's view into the nightmarish landscape, or Engineer Davis's fateful step through the door? 2/2. Chapter 3. The Key's Secrets. The Key's Purpose. The Bellwether factory was no ordinary structure. Beneath its decrepit floors and rusted machinery lay clues to a darker history. Dr. Moran and her team uncovered a hidden room in the factory's sub-basement, filled with rotted crates, crumbling papers, and an altar-like structure made of blackened stone. The altar bore the same symbols found on the keys. Amid the chaos, an ancient ledger bound in cracked leather caught Moran's attention. Its pages were filled with archaic symbols and weathered English. Through careful translation, the team deciphered fragments of the text, hoping that brief hints might ail him about the side type for. The keys are not to be used for exploration. They are seals. Each one binds the door tighter against the realm beyond. If unbound, the gates shall swing wide, and they shall step through. Moran's stomach churned as the implications sank in. They had been using the keys to open the door, when their true purpose was to lock it. The more the door was opened, the weaker the barrier became. Backstory revealed. While the team worked to translate the ledger, another discovery came to light: the journals of Alina Croft, the factory's enigmatic founder. Croft, a wealthy industrialist, had purchased the property in 1924 after a series of strange events in the area. In one entry, Croft wrote, "I found them buried in the earth, the 12 keys, and the door they belonged to. I knew at once they were no ordinary artifacts. The whispers began soon after. They called to me, promising wonders but delivering nightmares." As Croft continued to experiment with the door, his writing grew increasingly erratic. He described horrifying visions of twisted landscapes and monstrous entities that whisper through the veil. His final entry read, "They want the door open. They want to come through. I must seal it. I must—" The journal ended abruptly, and Croft was never seen again. His disappearance was filed away as another unsolved mystery of Overhaven. Unforeseen events. Back at the factory, the atmosphere grew increasingly oppressive. The door, which had remained dormant for hours, began to vibrate and emit a low-frequency hum. The sound was barely perceptible, but seemed to burrow into the minds of everyone present. Hallucinations became common. Dr. Patel claimed to see shadowy figures moving just beyond the edge of her vision. Agent Ruiz reported hearing his deceased mother's voice, calling him to the door. Tensions flared as paranoia set in, culminating in a violent argument between Ruiz and one of the researchers. "Enough!" Moran shouted, slamming her hand on a nearby console. "We're not losing control. Everyone, take a step back and focus." But even Moran wasn't immune. In quiet moments, she felt an overwhelming pull toward the door, as if it were alive, calling her to approach. Cliffhanger. Amid the growing chaos, Moran decided to test another key. She selected key 9, its surface etched with a swirling, hypnotic pattern. As she inserted it into the lock, the hum intensified, and the door groaned. What lay beyond was unlike anything they had seen before. a void of infinite blackness. No stars, no light, just a suffocating emptiness that seemed to stretch forever. Moran leaned closer, trying to make sense of the darkness. Her heart pounded as she felt something staring back at her. A massive, unblinking eye opened in the void, its iris an ever-shifting kaleidoscope of colors. The room filled with a deep, resonant voice, each word shaking the air and her bones. "You were not meant to find us." The door slammed shut on its own, the impact shaking the factory. Moran stumbled back, her breath ragged, as the echoes of the voice lingered in the air. She turned to her team, her face pale. "We're in way over our heads," she whispered. "Would you like an illustration of the colossal eye in the void, or the hidden altar beneath the factory?" Chapter 4. The Breach. The door unleashed. The bellwether factory had become a fortress of activity. Armed guards patrolled its perimeter, while researchers worked in controlled chaos within its labyrinthine halls. Tensions were high. The warnings from Jonah and the unsettling discoveries of the keys weighed heavily on everyone. Desperate for answers, Dr. Moran made the fateful decision to test Key 12. Its surface was smooth and cold, engraved with intricate spirals that seemed to move when viewed from the corner of one's eye. Despite misgivings, the team prepared for the experiment, sealing off the room and activating every safety measure at their disposal. As the key turned in the lock, the door began to glow with an intensity far beyond any previous experiment. Alarms blared as energy readings spiked off the charts. Then, with a deafening crack, the door burst open. A wave of darkness spilled into the room like liquid shadow, devouring light and sound. From the void emerged figures, twisted, angular beings with impossibly long limbs and featureless faces, their movements jerky and unnatural. The air filled with an unbearable screech as the entities fully crossed the threshold. Survival horror. The factory erupted into chaos. Lights flickered as the intruders stalked through the halls, their elongated forms bending and twisting in defiance of natural laws. The facility itself began to change, the walls warping and shifting into organic, pulsating structures. Time seemed to fracture, with moments stretching into eternity or collapsing into flashes. Dr. Moran and her team were trapped. The beings moved with an eerie silence, their predatory intent unmistakable. One by one, the team members were hunted. Ruiz was dragged into the shadows, his screams abruptly silenced. Patel vanished into a corridor that folded in on itself, leaving only her blood-stained clipboard behind. Moran and the few remaining survivors barricaded themselves in the control room. The sound of clawed appendages scraping against the walls grew louder, closer. Panic gripped the group, but Moran's mind raced for a solution. "They're not random," she whispered, her gaze fixed on the glowing keys scattered on the table. "The keys, each one resonates with the door in a specific way. We need to find the right combination to close it." Sacrifice and loss. Suddenly, the door to the control room was wrenched open, but it wasn't one of the creatures that entered. It was Jonah. His body was emaciated, his eyes glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. His movements were mechanical, as if his body were being puppeted by an unseen force. "Jonah!" Moran gasped, her voice trembling. "It's not him anymore." The voice from Jonah's mouth was deep and layered, a cacophony of alien tones. "But I can guide you. The door must be sealed, or your world will fall." The team hesitated, but Jonah's possessed form stepped forward and began arranging the keys on the table. "Each key is a lock, a chain, but to close the gate there must be a price." "What kind of price?" Moran asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jonah's glowing eyes locked onto hers. "A light." Cliffhanger. Guided by Jonah's instructions, Moran and the remaining team hurried back to the door. The air around was thick and oppressive, and the ground trembled with the vibrations of an unnatural hum. As Jonah inserted the keys in the correct sequence, The door began to glow with a blinding light. Just as the final key was turned, the void began to collapse in on itself. The entities screeched in fury, pulled back toward the other side, but before the door fully closed, one of them slipped through, a massive writhing mass of tentacles and eyes, its form shifting and reshaping in grotesque ways. The creature smashed through the factory walls and vanished into the night, heading toward Overhaven. Moran collapsed to her knees as the door sealed shut with a final, echoing boom. Jonah's body fell lifeless to the ground, the alien light fading from his eyes. In the distance, the town's alarm bells began to ring, and the faint sounds of screams reached the team's ears. "They're not done," Moran whispered, her voice hollow. "It's only just beginning." Would you like an illustration of the entities emerging from the door or the creature escaping into the town? Chapter 5. Lockdown. Final confrontation. The town of Overhaven descended into chaos. The entity, a towering mass of shifting tentacles and unblinking eyes, moved through the streets with horrifying speed. Its form absorbed everything in its path. Cars, streetlights, and even people, melding them into its grotesque, ever-changing body. Screams echoed as residents fled in terror, only to be engulfed and assimilated. Dr. Moran and the surviving team arrived on the scene in a Foundation vehicle, armed with experimental weaponry designed for extreme anomalous threats. High-powered plasma rifles, sonic disruptors, and a prototype reality stabilizer were deployed in a desperate attempt to slow the creature's advance. "Focus on the core," Moran shouted, pointing to a pulsating, eye-like structure in the center of the entity. The team unleashed their arsenal, the weapons tearing chunks from the creature's mass. For a moment it recoiled, its movements faltering, but the respite was brief. The entity lashed out, its tendrils smashing buildings and overturning vehicles. "Fall back," Moran ordered, her voice strained. "We can't stop it here. We need to seal the door." Race against time. The team retreated to the factory, the entity in pursuit. The damaged building groaned under its weight as it began to meld with the creature's presence. Walls twisted, and the air itself seemed to shimmer, bending the rules of reality. Jonah's lifeless body, left where it had fallen, stirred as the team entered. His eyes opened, glowing with an otherworldly light. The alien intelligence within him spoke, its voice calm yet imposing. "The keys must be used once more. The correct sequence will bind the gate forever. But a life must anchor the seal." Moran looked at Jonah, her heart heavy. "Alive? Whose?" A being gazed at her, silent but deliberate. "No," Ruiz protested. "There has to be another way." "There isn't," Moran said quietly, a resigned determination in her eyes. "This is bigger than us. Bigger than me." Moran approached the door, her fingers brushing over the cold, glowing keys. With Jonah guiding her, she began to place them in sequence, her movements steady despite the chaos around her. Bittersweet victory. As the final key clicked into place, the door began to glow, its surface rippling with otherworldly energy. The factory shook violently, chunks of debris raining down as the seal began to take effect. The entity outside howled in agony, its tendrils thrashing wildly as it was dragged back toward the collapsing void. Dr. Moran stood before the door, her face illuminated by the pulsating light. She turned to her team, a faint smile on her lips. "Take care of the rest," she said. "Make sure this doesn't happen again." Before anyone could stop her, she stepped into the light, her body consumed by the energy of the closing gate. The room filled with a deafening roar as the doors sealed shut, its power collapsing in on itself. The remaining team barely escaped as the factory imploded, burying the door, the keys, and everything else beneath tons of rubble. Epilogue. Months later, the site of the Bellwether factory was little more than a fenced-off ruin. The SCP Foundation had declared the area restricted, with signs warning of hazardous materials. Most of Overhaven's residents had relocated, unwilling to live near the scene of the nightmare. But curiosity has a way of defying caution. a lone archaeologist, conducting an unauthorized dig at the edge of the rubble, unearthed a strange object. Wiping away the dirt, he revealed an ancient, rusted key etched with swirling patterns that seemed to shift under his touch. As he held the key up to the light, he thought he heard a faint whisper. SCP-5 Skeleton Key. Chapter 1. The Key Opened. The metallic hum of fluorescent lights echoed through the sterile white corridors of Site-47, one of the SCP Foundation's most secure containment facilities. Armed guards patrolled the labyrinthine halls, their expressions hardened by years of vigilance. Behind sealed vaults and reinforced steel doors lay some of the world's most dangerous anomalies, each held in check by the sheer ingenuity of human engineering and an unwavering commitment to secrecy and legitimacy. At the heart of the facility, Dr. Eliza Greaves stood in front of a display case containing SCP-5. The object was almost laughably innocuous, a small brass skeleton key, worn and dull, as though it belonged in the pocket of a Victorian schoolteacher. Yet the unassuming artifact possessed the chilling ability to unlock any lock, regardless of complexity or security measures. Eliza adjusted her glasses, her gaze unwavering as she reviewed the anomaly's file. Reports of unusual incidents involving locked doors had been steadily increasing, sealed bank vaults inexplicably emptied, high-security prison cells mysteriously opened, and even airlocks on spacecraft suddenly found ajar. Each scene bore a common thread. SCP-5 had been spotted nearby, despite its supposedly secure containment at Site-47. "How does something like this keep leaving fingerprints where it shouldn't?" Eliza murmured, more to herself than to the guards stationed nearby. A security officer beside her shrugged. "If I knew that, Doc, I'd be wearing a lab coat, not armor." Eliza chuckled dryly, though her unease lingered. She turned back to her tablet, where a stream of raw data from SCP-5's containment cell appeared stable. Still, the unsettling incidents worldwide suggested something far beyond mere coincidence. Hours later, the hum of the facility was disrupted by a piercing klaxon. Eliza froze mid-step as red emergency lights began to strobe, painting the halls in alternating flashes of crimson and shadow. "Containment breach in sectors 3 through 7. An automated voice blared through the intercom. "All personnel to lockdown stations." Eliza's heart raced as she turned to the nearest guard. "What breached containment?" she demanded. "Multiple SCPs," the guard replied, his face pale. "They're saying vaults are opening on their own. Systems are compromised." Eliza felt a chill creep down her spine. She instinctively knew this wasn't a coincidence. Grabbing a portable tablet from a nearby station, she accessed the surveillance feed. On the screen, several secured vault doors were ajar, their interiors disturbingly empty. Objects that should never see the light of day were now unaccounted for. In one frame, SCP-5 lay innocently on the floor, as though it had simply been dropped. "Play it back," she ordered, her voice trembling. The footage rewound, and Eliza's stomach churned. A shadowy figure, its form indistinct and shifting like smoke, reached for SCP-5. It seemed to pulse in its hand, glowing faintly before the figure inserted it into a vault door. The door swung open effortlessly, and the figure faded into the shadows. Eliza paused the footage, her finger hovering over the silhouette. "What the hell is that?" she whispered. Before she could dwell on the question, the facility shuddered violently. Distant crashes echoed through the halls, and screams filled the intercom as panicked personnel relayed their final, garbled messages. "Something's in the lower levels," a voice screamed. Oh God, it's huge! We can't—" The transmission cut off abruptly. Eliza felt the walls tremble, the vibrations resonating deep in her chest. The air grew colder, and the lights flickered erratically. She bolted for the nearest lockdown terminal, but the automated systems refused to respond. "Emergency lockdown compromised," the intercom voice intoned, eerily calm, all doors opening. Eliza's eyes widened in horror as every door in the facility began to creak open, one after another. Vault doors, security gates, even emergency bulkheads meant to contain catastrophic breaches, all slid open as though obeying a silent command. A deep guttural roar echoed from the depths of the facility, shaking the floor beneath her feet. Eliza clutched the terminal for support, her mind racing. Whatever was stirring below wasn't just another SCP. It was something far worse. As Eliza looked down the now open corridor, shadows seemed to coil and writhe with a will of their own. A single thought dominated her mind. This isn't just a breach. It's a summoning. Chapter 2. Echoes Beyond the Threshold. The facility lay in a shroud of chaos. Alarms wailed intermittently, casting eerie flashes of red light down the now abandoned corridors. The air seemed heavier, oppressive, as if something unseen was pressing against the physical walls of reality itself. Dr. Eliza Grebe stood at the head of a small, hastily assembled security team, their breaths fogging the air despite the heat of the emergency lights. "The glucoms are down beyond sub-level 3, one of the guards muttered. "Whatever caused this breach, it's not just SCPs running loose." Eliza nodded, clutching the datapad with logs from the initial breach. The readings were erratic, almost nonsensical, with entire blocks of encrypted data replaced by symbols that seemed to twist on the screen. At the center of it all was SCP-5, which had inexplicably appeared at multiple breach sites without explanation. "We need to move," Eliza said firmly, her voice cutting through the palpable tension. "If SCP-5 is being manipulated, it's more than just a tool. It's the key to all of this, literally." The team descended deeper into the restricted sectors, where the facility's most dangerous SCPs were stored. The farther they went, the stranger things became. The corridors no longer followed logical layouts. Hallways looped back on themselves. Doors opened to blank walls, and distant sounds of footsteps and whispers echoed with no discernible source. Eliza's grip on her datapad tightened. The readings showed a rising energy field unlike anything she had encountered. Worse, the team began experiencing shared hallucinations. Images of twisting doorways, endless labyrinths, and shadows moving just beyond the edge of their lights. "What the hell is this?" one guard whispered, his voice trembling. "This wasn't here before. It's like the walls are alive." Eliza forced herself to focus. She recalled fragments of data from the Foundation archives, hints of SCP-5's deeper origins. Legends of an ancient civilization, one that worshipped a being called the Gatekeeper. This entity, it was said, was imprisoned long ago, locked behind countless barriers to prevent it from consuming entire worlds. SCP-5, she realized, might not have been a tool for locking doors, but rather a relic of that civilization, a device tied intrinsically to the Gatekeeper's imprisonment. The team reached a sealed containment room, its reinforced door half open, warped as if something immense had pushed against it. Inside, the air shimmered with an unnatural haze. A researcher lay slumped against the far wall, unmoving, with SCP-5 clutched tightly in one hand. Strange carvings spiraled out from the researcher's position, etched into the walls, floor, and ceiling. The symbols pulsed faintly with an otherworldly light. Eliza knelt beside the comatose figure, carefully prying SCP-5 from their grasp. The key felt unnaturally warm, vibrating faintly in her hand. She glanced back at the carvings, her eyes drawn to a recurring motif, a massive, many-limbed figure surrounded by concentric circles of locks. Her breath caught as the realization dawned. "It's not just unlocking doors," she murmured. "It's unlocking this. It's weakening the seals." The security team barely had time to process her words when a low, guttural rumble vibrated through the walls. The carvings began to glow brighter, and the air filled with a deep, resonant hum that seemed to bypass their ears and settle directly in their skulls. What's happening?" one of the guards shouted, panic rising in his voice. Eliza's eyes widened in horror. It's a conduit. SCP-5 isn't just opening doors, it's breaking the barriers that keep the Gatekeeper imprisoned. Before Eliza could act, the humming intensified. The room seemed to warp, the walls folding into themselves. The distant sound of cracking stone and metal reverberated as if the entire facility was being unmade. Eliza clutched SCP-5 tighter, knowing they were out of time. From the farthest corner of the room, a shadow darker than the void itself began to stretch and expand, moving toward them with deliberate, malevolent intent. Chapter 3. The Gatekeeper Awakens. The air in the lower levels of the facility felt as if it had been drained of oxygen, replaced by something heavier, alien, and alive. The emergency lighting flickered in irregular intervals, casting jagged shadows along the metal walls. Eliza and the remaining team moved cautiously, their breaths shallow as they descended deeper into the labyrinthine structure. The hum of the Gatekeeper's influence vibrated in their bones, growing louder with every step. "This place doesn't make sense anymore," one of the guards muttered, his voice strained. "The floor plans, these corridors shouldn't lead here." "It's not the facility that's changing," Eliza replied, gripping SCP-5 tightly. "It's the space around it. Reality is being rewritten." Locked doors, once impassable barriers, now acted as grotesque gateways. The first emerged with a bone-rattling shriek of metal, revealing a mass of slithering insectoid creatures with too many limbs and eyes that glowed like embers. The team opened fire, the staccato of gunfire reverberating as the creatures surged forward, claws raking against walls and flesh. "They're pouring in from everywhere," one of the guards shouted, his voice tinged with desperation. "Keep moving," Eliza barked. "We have to reach the core containment chamber. It's the only chance we have to stop this." The creatures seemed endless, crawling from the shadows of rooms where the seals had failed. One of the guards, screaming in terror, broke rank and ran back toward the elevator. He didn't get far before a twisting black tendril lashed out from an open door, pulling him into the darkness. His screams cut off abruptly. As the survivors regrouped, Eliza's mind raced. SCP-5 wasn't just breaking physical locks, it was dismantling the metaphysical barriers that separated dimensions. She recalled the carvings and the recurring figure of the Gatekeeper surrounded by concentric seals. The seals weren't just physical constructs, they were conceptual prisons, locking away the entity's influence. "5 is a fail-safe," she said aloud, more to herself than to the team. "It was designed to lock away threats, but something's corrupted it. The Gatekeeper, it's using the key as a tool to break free." The team stopped at an abandoned security station. Eliza sifted through the scattered documents and data logs, hoping for answers. Among them, she found an old report marked with the highest clearance levels. The file was incomplete, with entire sections redacted. But one line stood out. SCP-5, primary function, metaphysical containment failsafe. Warning, don't use in proximity to active dimensional rifts or anomalous resonances. The Gatekeeper's influence grew stronger as they approached the core. Paranoia and dread settled over the team like a thick fog. Shadows flickered unnaturally, and faint whispers that sounded like their own voices filled the air. "We're being hunted," one of the guards muttered, his wide eyes darting to the shadows. He raised his weapon, firing blindly at a non-existent enemy. Before anyone could stop him, he turned the barrel on himself, collapsing to the floor. Eliza and the last 2 remaining team members pressed on. Every step felt like wading through molasses as the walls warped and twisted, their surfaces pulsating faintly, almost organic in appearance. The hum of the Gatekeeper's power was deafening now, a low, guttural vibration that seemed to emanate from the core of their beings. When they finally reached the facility's core containment chamber, they were greeted by a sight that defied explanation. The massive, reinforced walls of the chamber had been reduced to a skeletal framework, twisted and corroded as though centuries had passed in mere hours. The containment field generators were silent, their lights flickering weakly. At the center of the room was a vast, pulsating black void. It seemed to ripple with malevolence. its surface stretching and undulating as if straining against the fabric of reality. Eliza could feel its pull, an almost magnetic force that drew her closer, promising knowledge, power, and destruction in equal measure. This is it," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The Gatekeeper." The void shifted, and a fragment of its form emerged, an incomprehensible mass of limbs, eyes, and twisting shapes that defied human logic. It wasn't just entering their reality, it was rewriting it. "Dr. Greaves," one of the guards said, his voice barely audible. "What do we do?" Eliza stared at the void, SCP-5 still clenched in her hand. The key felt alive, vibrating against her palm, as if it were urging her to act. Before Eliza could respond, the void expanded violently, consuming the far side of the chamber. The Gatekeeper's form grew more defined, its many eyes focusing on her. The containment alarms wailed one last time before falling silent, and the lights flickered out, plunging them into utter darkness. Chapter 4. Locking the Abyss. The facility was unrecognizable. Once a fortress of precision and containment, it now resembled a living, writhing nightmare. Walls crumbled and reformed with grotesque organic textures. Stairwells spiraled into impossible directions, and the very air shimmered with instability. The Gatekeeper's presence was no longer a lurking threat, it was here, asserting its dominion over the physical and metaphysical alike. Eliza stood in the remains of the core containment chamber, SCP-5 still warm and trembling in her hand. Her remaining allies, Private Lang and Captain Monroe, looked at her with a mixture of fear and determination. "We can't fight this thing," Monroe said grimly, his weapon gripped tightly. "But we can buy time. What's the plan, Doc?" Eliza swallowed hard, her mind racing. "The Gatekeeper isn't fully here yet. It's using the breaches to tether itself to our reality. We can reverse it, but—" She glanced at SCP-5, its golden surface glowing faintly in the dim light. "We need to manually reactivate the containment locks across the facility. SCP-5 can seal them, but it's drawn to the Gatekeeper. It's going to resist." Lang stepped forward, his voice shaking. "Then we better move fast." Splitting up, Eliza mapped out a desperate course. 3 critical containment nodes, spread across the facility, had to be reactivated. Each was tied to the ancient mechanisms designed to stabilize the dimensional barriers. The team would split up to maximize their chances, even as the facility collapsed around them. Eliza and Monroe made their way to the first node, while Lang set off alone toward the second. The third, deep within the restricted archives, would be Eliza's final destination. As they moved, the environment seemed to conspire against them. Hallways stretched and narrowed. Doors slammed shut without warning, and distant roars echoed through the shifting architecture. When Eliza and Monroe reached the first node, a jagged tear in reality pulsed above the control console. Alien creatures spilled through, half-formed nightmares of limbs and eyes, their movements jerky and unnatural. Monroe held them off with his rifle as Eliza scrambled to use SCP-5. The key trembled violently in her hand, as if fighting her. For a moment, the Gatekeeper's voice echoed in her mind, a deep, resonant tone promising salvation and understanding. "Take me, Eliza. You've seen your kind falter. You could rise above them. All you need to do is open." With a scream of defiance, Eliza forced SCP-5 into the lock. The node hissed to life, glowing with an intense blue light that severed the tear, causing the creatures to collapse into ash. Monroe grinned, but his relief was short-lived. "Keep going, Doc," he said, his gaze fixed on the encroaching darkness. "I'll cover the next leg." The cost of resistance. Eliza pressed forward alone, SCP-5's resistance growing stronger. Her thoughts blurred, fragmented by the Gatekeeper's whispers. It showed her visions of power, endless knowledge, immortality, and the ability to rewrite the fabric of reality itself. Each promise came with a temptation to stop fighting. At the second node, Lang activated the controls, only to be overwhelmed by a massive eldritch creature, a towering mass of writhing tendrils and mouths. His screams over the comms jolted Eliza from her stupor, and she pushed herself forward, guilt gnawing at her. The Gatekeeper revealed. By the time Eliza reached the archives, the Gatekeeper's influence was suffocating. The final node lay in a cavernous room where reality itself seemed to bend. Above her, the Gatekeeper's partially manifested form loomed, a horrifying amalgam of shifting limbs, infinite eyes, and an aura of overwhelming dread. Its voice echoed directly in her mind, louder now, more insistent. "This is futile. The locks are weak. You cannot win." Eliza clutched SCP-5, its glow dimming as if it too were succumbing to the Gatekeeper's will. Her resolve faltered, her mind teetering on the edge of surrender. Suddenly, a deafening explosion rocked the room. Monroe, bloodied and battered, stumbled into the chamber. "No time to doubt yourself, Doc," he shouted, opening fire on the Gatekeeper's looming form. His bullets did little to harm it, but they drew its attention, giving Eliza precious moments to reach the final lock. Monroe turned to her, his eyes steady. "Do what you need to do. I'll hold it off as long as I can." Alone at the final lock, Eliza reached the final node as Monroe's screams echoed behind her. She forced SCP-5 into the lock, her hands trembling. The mechanism resisted, sparks flying as the room shook violently. The Gatekeeper's voice filled her mind, now a cacophony of anger and despair. "You cannot imprison me. You will only delay the inevitable." With a final burst of strength, Eliza turned the key. The lock began to hum with energy, but she was alone now, with the Gatekeeper's full wrath bearing down upon her. Chapter 5. Sealed and Forgotten. Eliza stepped into the heart of the surreal nightmare. The containment chamber no longer resembled anything constructed by human hands. The walls stretched endlessly into a swirling void, illuminated by a dim, sickly light that seemed to emanate from nowhere and everywhere. The air shimmered like heat waves, warping her vision, and a faint, otherworldly hum throbbed in her ears. In the center of it all stood the Gatekeeper, a towering, incomprehensible mass of limbs, eyes, and shifting geometry. Its form defied logic, as if the very act of looking at it was an affront to her sanity. The Gatekeeper turned its countless eyes toward her, its voice booming directly into her mind. "You think you can stop me, Eliza? You who failed to protect them, who let them die?" Exalted the mind. The Gatekeeper's words tore into her like claws. Visions of her past failures flooded her mind, her team members consumed by the creatures, her inability to prevent the breach, the lives lost because she wasn't fast enough, strong enough, or smart enough. The images twisted and distorted, becoming cruel exaggerations of the truth. "You brought this upon them," the Gatekeeper whispered, its tone mocking. "They trusted you, and you betrayed them." Eliza dropped to her knees, clutching SCP-5. The key felt impossibly heavy now, its surface glowing faintly as if resisting the Gatekeeper's presence. Her thoughts spiraled into despair, the weight of her guilt pressing down on her chest like an iron vice. Revelation of the key. Through the haze of despair, Eliza's gaze fell on SCP-5. For a moment, the Gatekeeper's influence faltered, and she saw the key clearly. Its surface shimmered with intricate carvings, symbols she hadn't noticed before. They seemed to shift and glow, as if alive, and in that instant, understanding flooded her mind. The key was more than a tool. It was a failsafe, designed not only to lock physical doors, but also to seal dimensional rifts. But there was a cost. The mechanism required a sacrifice, a life force to power the seal and restore the barriers. Eliza's hands trembled as the realization sank in. "That's why it resisted," she murmured. "It knows what it needs." The final choice. The Gatekeeper loomed closer, its form expanding and twisting, filling the space with an oppressive, suffocating presence. Eliza rose to her feet, SCP-5 in hand, and faced the entity. Her voice was steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. "You're right," she said, her voice echoing in the void. "I failed them, but I won't fail now." The Gatekeeper roared, its countless mouths opening in unison. "You are nothing. You cannot defeat me. You cannot even save yourself." Eliza ignored the words, focusing on the glowing lock mechanism embedded in the ground. She stepped forward, raising SCP-5. The key's carvings flared brighter as it recognized her intent, its resistance fading. With a deep breath, Eliza plunged the key into the lock. A surge of energy erupted, coursing through her body and into the mechanism. Pain exploded in her chest as her life force was drained, the very essence of her being fueling the containment sequence. The Gatekeeper howled in fury as the dimensional rift began to close, its form collapsing inward. Collapse of the facility. The chamber shook violently as the seal activated. The void around her began to fracture, collapsing into itself. The Gatekeeper's presence faded, its roars turning into a distant echo. Eliza fell to her knees, her vision dimming, but a faint smile crossed her lips. "It's done," she whispered, her voice barely audible. As the facility crumbled into nothingness, Eliza's body disintegrated into glowing motes of light, merging with the seal and becoming a permanent part of the barrier. Aftermath and mystery. Weeks later, a recovery team combed through the ruins of the facility. Most of it had been swallowed by the collapsing dimensional rift, leaving only fragments of what had once been a sprawling complex. Among the debris they found SCP-5, untouched and pristine. The key was returned to containment, its surface now engraved with faint new symbols that no one could decipher. The event was classified under strict Level 5 clearance, and all records of the incident were redacted. Dr. Eliza Greaves' name was quietly removed from Foundation records, her sacrifice erased, but never forgotten by those who knew the truth. In a dimly lit research chamber, a young Foundation researcher picked up SCP-5 for further study. They turned it over in their hands, marveling at its simplicity. For a brief moment, as they examined its surface, faint, shadowy shapes flickered in the reflection of the key, twisting forms and countless eyes that vanished as quickly as they appeared. The researcher frowned, then shrugged, placing the key back on the table. Deep within its golden surface, the Gatekeeper's faint whispers echoed, almost imperceptible. "This is not the end.